Did you know? In Metal Gear Solid, the prison cell guard gave Meryl more toilet paper than he gave the DARPA chief. According to developers, it's because he was more considerate of the lady. It's worth highlighting that 9 years later, that same guard, Johnny Sasaki, got hitched with Meryl in MGS4. The devil had eyes on her from the very beginning. And it all started with making sure her bog roll was well stocked. Fellas, let that be a lesson to you. I'm David Hayter, the voice of Solid Snake. That TP guard tidbit was revealed in Metal Gear Solid Integral, which was sort of like a special edition of the game released in Japan. Integral featured about 400 codec calls from the developers with behind-the-scenes details that have never been translated into English until this video. Some have never been heard before except by Japanese fans. Today, we're going to level the playing field and highlight 40 of our favorite codecs, revealing cut content, hard-to-find secrets, Easter eggs, and even some developer stories. We'll start at the beginning and work our way forward chronologically. In one of the first integral codecs, system administrator Yoshikazu Matsuhana says the original plan for the heliport area was that Snake would have to get around by hiding in the shadow of a moving forklift, but the sequence ended up getting scrapped. The forklift still made it into the game though. It's sitting idle in the back corner of the dock area. Most fans probably never even noticed it was there. The team had big plans for that forklift, but it was ultimately demoted to just being a decoration. Speaking of the heliport, the sound director says if you stand by the cliff's edge, you can hear the sound of waves. You can't see the waves, and they're meant to be far below, so you can just barely hear them. But it's an in-game detail most players would never find on their own. These calls are scattered all over the game. In Integral, you can call codec frequency 140.07 whenever you want, and the staff will tell you something interesting. One's about the codec itself. The programming director says the static when you talk to them, and also when you're talking to Deep Throat, is actually binary code from the game's programming forcibly pasted in as textures. When it's time to find the DARPA chief, you can actually see him about 10 minutes before you're supposed to by manipulating the camera. The devs knew it was possible, so they added a special chime to reward players who found the secret. On his way to meet the chief face-to-face, Snake has to crawl through some air ducts. Looking down, you can see a soldier who appears to be using the latrine.
I hate Alaska. Boy, oh boy, that woman is built all right.
But the devs say this genome soldier's not peeing or pooping. He's just avoiding doing his job. Slacking. Quiet quitting. When you finally find the DARPA chief, one of the pixel artists points out you've already seen him without realizing it. Remember the submarine cutscene at the very beginning? The chief was actually reused as one of the sailors. You can see him right here. Recycling him saved a little time and money. After eavesdropping on Snake and the chief's chat, Meryl knocks out the guard. Again, that's her future husband, and steals his clothes. One of the scriptwriters says, quote, "Don't you want to get a closer look at Johnny Sasaki passed out in his underwear? Get as close as you can facing him and then crouch. Look how the camera angle changes. We call it the sexy rear cam." In some international releases, including the American version, Johnny, in nothing but his nut huts, was changed to him being buck naked with his Johnson blurred. So sadly, some of y'all won't be able to get the full sexy rear cam experience for yourselves. Moving on. Right before the fight with Ocelot, he'll twirl his revolver for 10 or 15 seconds. According to animator Nobuyoshi Nishimura, he originally spun it a lot longer. So long, in fact, that everyone else on the dev team was cracking up from the absurdity. "You can't take things too far," he said, and made it less absurd by shortening the scene. It's worth noting that in Metal Gear Solid 3, Ocelot introduces himself with a full 30 seconds of gun twirling. Apparently, with time, they learned to embrace the absurdity. When fighting against the tank, it fires a shell and Snake flip jumps out of the way. That wasn't actually supposed to happen, but in a way, it gave birth to the Snake we know and love. According to animator Nishimura, the scene where Snake jumps to avoid a shot from the M1 tank came from art director Shinkawa's storyboard. However, in the storyboard, he just rolled out of the way, but I misread it and I thought Snake did a cool jump to dodge it, so that's the animation I made. I was told, "It looks cool, so we'll leave it in," and I think that kicked off the beginning of Snake getting a bunch of flashy animations. During the tank battle, they say if you dodge the first 6 shots but get hit by the 7th, Raven gives you a different cutscene. Here's the normal cutscene when Snake gets hit. And here's the scene if you get hit by the 7th shell. Soon after, you can do a camera trick to spot Otacon earlier than intended, just like the DARPA chief. Again, the devs treat you to a secret chime. After that, you have to guide a remote-controlled missile over an electric floor. One dev says this part was originally a lot harder, but they toned down the difficulty later in development. He also asks the player to see what happens if Snake gets electrocuted when he's in a cardboard box. This is what the normal animation looks like. And this is the animation the dev wanted us to see, box and all. In another call, they encourage us to see what happens if Snake falls into a pit while he's wearing a box. Again, here's the normal animation. And now, the box version. As you approach your first fight with Cyber Ninja, in the hall full of dead soldiers, you can hear some strange intonations. According to the sound director, that was Hideo Kojima's idea, and it's supposed to be Ninja reciting the names of certain railway stations in Kansai, Japan. Those particular stations all had nice rings to them, and I think they match Ninja's Japanese image. During the fight, one of the programmers says he made attacks where Ninja shoots beams from his eyes, and another where he splits into 3, so Snake has to battle 3 ninjas at once. But ultimately, both of those attacks got scrapped. Although the cloning attack was kind of repurposed for the Pain in MGS3, whom they made split into 2. After every boss battle, Snake does a strange gesture as he regenerates his health. According to animator Nishimura, this action had the most troubled development of any animation in the game. Countless other animations got rejected, and with so few results to show for her time, all her colleagues thought she was a slacker. It's kinda hard to make out what Snake's actually doing when he regenerates, so in 2021, Nishimura tweeted some clarification, saying it's supposed to be Snake clenching his fists with all his strength. In the next cutscene, Otacon tells Snake he can deduce which soldier is Meryl in disguise due to her feminine form.
She had such a cute way of walking. She kind of wiggles her behind.
You were really looking.
Well, she's got a very cute behind.
Way of walking, huh?
The devs say that butt-wiggling animation was called Catwalk, and likewise the animation for Snake accepting a Kodak call was Honey Flash. At that same point in the game, the programming director says Otacon had a secret anime room that got scrapped. Quote, "At first, there was a way to get from under Otacon's desk to a hidden room where he stashed his anime merch. The models and textures were all complete, but it ultimately got rejected for various reasons, unfortunately."
Call me Otacon.
Otacon?
It stands for Otaku Convention. An otaku's a guy like me who likes Japanimation.
When Snake's going through the wolf caves, the sound director says, if you wear the cardboard box here, the dogs might pee on you. There are a lot of situations involving pee and poop in Metal Gear Solid. You could think of it as Hideo Kojima's long-held hobby. In your first sniper shootout with Wolf, the sound director chimes back in to say you can shoot the rats scampering around. But they couldn't come up with a good squeak effect, so they reused the rat sounds from the back alleys in Police Knots, the previous Kojima game, which released in 1994 but never left Japan. Side by side, you can hear they're the same. When Sniper Wolf captures Snake, one of the animators says, I had to change these animations to avoid model clipping, but in the process, the sexiness got blown out of proportion. Snake got to touch Wolf and probably got a peek at her breasts, so he must have been happy. Following Snake's harrowing escape from his cell, he's pursued by Liquid in a Hind D. A programmer says bullets raining down were supposed to intensify the player's hatred for the chopper. But the dev laments that in the final game, the damage-dealing steam turned out to be more annoying than the bullets. So unfortunately, the sequence actually intensified the player's hatred for steam instead of the Hind. After blowing up Liquid in his chopper and wandering around in the snow a bit, a dev call asks you if you noticed the parachute in the ditch, foreshadowing the later reveal that Liquid survived the explosion. Finding it in first person triggers a very brief cutscene and a Kodak call.
Colonel, listen to me. I found a parachute near the wreckage of the Hind.
A parachute? You don't think that Liquid survived?
Impossible. As soon as he jumped out of the pilot's seat, he'd be sliced up faster than an onion on an infomercial.
Moving on to Disc 2. When you're going down on the elevator, or I think technically it might be a funicular, one of the programmers explains that it's not actually moving. Instead, an optical illusion was created by scrolling the surrounding textures up and down. They also say this part of the game was inspired by a certain movie, almost certainly a nod to Akira, the 1988 cyberpunk anime classic, which included a very similar scene. Another call says their homage was beaten to the punch mid-development by a competing video game, probably Resident Evil 2, which also has a similar scene and released 8 months earlier. The Metal Gear team thought about cutting the elevator sequence when they realized their thunder had been stolen, but ultimately decided to leave it in. Careful around all that fire. According to animation dev Nishimura, if you get too close to the blast furnace, Snake will slip and fall in. The animation for slipping came out great, like he stepped on a banana peel. But later, when we got into debugging, we couldn't get it to trigger anywhere. Why? Why? It turned out the animation got cut earlier in development. The hangar housing Metal Gear Rex is 3 stories tall. Call the devs within, and a scenery modeler says they struggled with consistency here in Shadow Moses' largest set piece. If you look at the floor on 1F, it looks one way, but if you look down at the same floor from 3F, it looks different. Whoops. Also in the hangar, there's a cutscene where Snake eavesdrops on Ocelot and Liquid while they very loudly explain their evil plans. Animator Shimizu says she was real proud of her work here, but the rest of the team laughed at her for how she made Ocelot so fast and skillful on a keyboard. Old men in the 90s did not type that fast, especially after their right hand gets cut off. When it's time to duke it out with Liquid mano a mano, enemy logic programmer Yuji Korikado says the fight's stupidly hard on extreme difficulty, which was implemented with hardcore American players in mind. In fact, the entirety of MGS1 was harder in America. In Japan, the original release only had 1 difficulty setting, equivalent to the American Easy mode. Art director Yoji Shinkawa asks us to see what happens if Snake keeps calling Mei Ling but never saves. At first, it's no big deal.
Talk to you later, Snake.
But after a few pointless calls, she gets annoyed.
Come on, Snake, don't call me for no reason.
Eventually, she stops talking and just makes funny faces. Yoji Shinkawa is the guy who designed Metal Gear Rex. In another call, he says they didn't consider how Rex would walk until after the design was already finished, which gave him some trouble. Ultimately, they decided to have it stand on its tiptoes and fold in its heels. Also, Nishimura says the claws on Rex's feet dig into the ground when they settle, but it can't be seen on screen, so it's more like an invisible but canonical design detail. Metal Gear Solid has 2 endings, one with Otacon and one with Meryl. In the first, animator Yoshimura says she was instructed, presumably by Kojima, to make Otacon's unsteady footing on the snowy hill look like a comedy routine. She also says when Otacon sees the snowmobile, he giddily exclaims, "The snowmobile!" like a childish otaku, shattering the somber tone because he's a silly, silly man. That line appears to have gotten cut, though, and covered up by Naomi's monologue. His talking animation's still left in, but he got muted. Probably for the best.
That's how all life works. Loving each other, teaching each other.
And in the other ending, pixel artist Nakamura says, Meryl's wearing an orange vest in the final scene. Does it look familiar? The design's a little different, but it looks a lot like the vest Dave wears in Police Knots. Try to let your imagination run wild. Meryl was actually in Police Knots before Metal Gear, and Dave was her partner in the Vice unit. Here come Police Knots spoilers, so skip ahead 15 seconds if you don't want to hear them. But maybe the implications that she took it off Dave after he died. His dying words were that he loved the way she smelled after all. There are Police Knots references all over Metal Gear, but the games don't really exist in the same canon universe. Well, mostly anyway. Also in that ending cutscene, Snake and Meryl see a caribou with its young, which are meant to drive home the theme of passing on your genes. Yoshimura says she worked like a dog to animate natural, believable movements for those 2 caribou. It's the final scene after all, so she wanted to make it perfect and redid it again and again. But then she screwed up and deleted all her work, leaving her pale as a sheet. So the caribou that made it into the final game didn't look nearly as good. After beating the game, you're rewarded with a bandana you can wear for infinite ammo. On the development team, they called it seaweed because of how it sways in the wind, like seaweed underwater. So if you want to look cool at a Metal Gear party, don't call it a bandana, call it seaweed. I'm David Hayter, and I'll be back soon with more newly translated Metal Gear content. So subscribe if you don't want to miss it. Did you know every copy of Metal Gear Solid 2 was almost personalized? Or more specifically, every rose was personalized. According to Kojima's development diary, which we just had translated into English for the very first time, in the middle of production, the team decided Raiden's radio wouldn't show Rose's face. You could hear her voice, but couldn't see her. Kojima's idea was that throughout the game, it'd ask you about your taste in women, preferences, and so on. Then, based on your answers, the game would generate a 3D model of your ideal female fantasy. And it wouldn't be until the final cutscene that you'd finally lay eyes on her. But ultimately, Kojima decided players would be less motivated to save her if they didn't know what she looked like all along. You know, since she's pretty. Because at the time, in addition to being Raiden's girlfriend, her backstory was that she was a journalist who had been taken hostage and you need to rescue her, while the frequency for saving your game was manned by another character called Data. But Data ended up getting axed so that Rose could take his job. Another idea that didn't make the cut was a genderless magician. Kojima went to Hawaii and saw the Magic of Polynesia show, where they had firewalking, magic, that kind of thing. He wrote in his diary, "As soon as I saw that magic, I knew I had to add a genderless magician boss character. They bring out an empty box, cover it with a cloth, and then when they take it away, amazingly, enemies come bustling out from inside." He goes on to say he pitched the genderless magician to several of his staff, but no one else liked it, so eventually he abandoned the idea. I'm David Hayter. You might recognize my voice. I'm Snake's official voice actor. These stories of what might have been come from Kojima's Metal Gear Solid 2 diary, in which he made semi-daily entries for the entirety of the game's development. He titled it Development Diary, Hideo Kojima, 4 Years of Struggle. He published it in the Japan-only Making of MGS2 book and revealed lots of unused ideas, cut content, and behind-the-scenes stories, some of which were never told anywhere else. There are lots of important documents in video game history that have gone untranslated for decades, and this was one of them. Until now. The diary's pretty long, about 87 pages if you printed it out in English, so in this video we'll just cover the highlights. Let's get started. In the final game, there's a part where Raiden swims underwater with Emma. It goes off without a hitch, but while they're underwater, Kojima originally wanted blood seeping out of Emma's crotch. When they surface, Raiden would ask, "Where are you hurt?" And Emma would blush and say, I'm fine. Later in the game, Emma's fatally stabbed by Vamp. Raiden's concerned about how much blood she's losing. Then she'd look up and say, "I'm fine, it's just my period," and then fall over dead. Those would have been her dying words. Kojima says his staff unanimously hated the idea, so it didn't make the final cut either. Also in the final game, when Raiden's running around Arsenal Gear, there are 6 rooms, all named after internal organs. Arsenal Gear's stomach, jejunum, ileum, colon, and rectum. But Kojima also wanted rooms called Arsenal Gear Uterus and Arsenal Gear... Listen, the last video I did for Did You Know Gaming got age restricted, so cut me some slack. Anyway, regarding the ship's female anatomy, Kojima said, "I was met with opposition from the childish staff, so I decided against it." He also says he wanted a tattoo on Raiden's ass. No dice there either, I'm afraid. Towards the end of development, Kojima wrote excitedly in his diary that Mark Hamill auditioned for MGS2, the guy who played Luke Skywalker in Star Wars.
"I'll never turn to the dark side."
He says Hamill delivered an outstanding performance, but doesn't specify for which character. If we had to guess, the voice of Raiden probably makes the most sense. It's unclear why he didn't end up getting the role, and as far as we can tell, Hamill's never spoken about it publicly. Another interesting tidbit Kojima mentioned is he modeled the Fortune fight after Space Invaders. Except the roles are reversed. Fortune's the laser cannon that barely moves, while Raiden plays the role of Invader. Never thought of it that way, but it makes sense seeing both games side by side. But actually, that wasn't how the Fortune fight was originally supposed to play out. Kojima writes in his diary, Raiden's clothes can catch fire during the battle with Fortune. Raiden's long hair, which he's so proud of, can catch fire too. And if the player doesn't put it out, Raiden's hair all burns off and he goes bald. After that, he continues completely bald throughout the entire game, even in cutscenes. The handsome protagonist goes bald in the first boss battle. Hilarious! He goes on to say, various wigs could be obtained throughout the game, including a Bakatano wig, which would have looked like this. If Raiden did a flip, his wig would fall off and the player would have to pick it back up. Ultimately though, Kojima got some pushback from his staff, so bald Raiden didn't make it into the final game. More hair loss was planned as well. In the release version, you can find a shaver as soon as you get to Big Shell. And if you give it to Snake later, he'll trim his beard. But originally, You'd obtain the shaver by tranquilizing Emma and shaking her. Presumably she had it for shaving her body hair. After stealing it, Pretty Boy Raiden would use it to shave his armpits. In an earlier diary entry, when the game was still in pre-production, Kojima said he wanted Sons of Liberty to end in an interactive Mexican standoff. He got the idea from Ringo Lam and Quentin Tarantino movies like Reservoir Dogs. He boasted, quote, "I've come up with another industry first, the real-time reveal system. This system's an attempt to present the grand finale of MGS2 in real time, with all the reveal sequences taking place with guns pointed at each other, like a Tarantino movie where 3 or more characters all have their guns pointed at each other, no one able to move. New information's revealed as they keep their guns pointed at each other. New characters join in, and people change who they're aiming at. A new character appears and says, 'Snake is actually an enemy,' so characters change their aim. And then Snake says, 'You've got the wrong guy. I was framed.' It's all a ploy by Solidus, so everyone changes sides again. Things go back and forth between Solidus, Ocelot, Snake, Raiden, Fortune, and Sergei, continuously changing who's aiming at who. I want to do that in real time. The player keeps the weapon button pressed with their gun pointed and watches the game unfold. Once the player lifts the gun, they can't release the button until the end of the game. During this final sequence, the player can change where they're aiming. Flashback scenes would be seen in split-screen mode. Wonder how it'll turn out." End quote. Well, unfortunately, it didn't turn out. In the final game, there was no Mexican standoff. The finale ended up as a one-on-one sword fight instead. We mentioned Data earlier, but several other characters ended up on the chopping block as well, like a couple of bosses, Chinaman and Old Boy, who Kojima writes in his diary got cut due to time restraints. There was also another AI character called Doc, similar to the AI Colonel. I already talked about them in a previous Did You Know Gaming video. But there's another cut character we'd never heard of before translating this diary, Snake's Spotter. Here's how Kojima describes him. Quote, "There was a legendary sniper in the Vietnam War who killed 64 enemies. But this character, he's not the sniper, he's a spotter. On his first mission, he caused that legendary sniper to miss and got him killed. Nowadays, he works security at Big Shell. His beloved wife passed away, so now he's devoted to his only son. But they become estranged when his son finds out about his past. He's familiar with the layout of Big Shell, and, in the end, he serves honorably as a spotter for Snake. He would have been voiced by Osamu Saka, but when the character got cut, Saka got cast as Colonel Gorlukovich instead." Speaking of voice actors, until pretty late in development, the actor who plays Liquid was also voicing Pliskin.
"There's room for only one Snake and one big boss,"
which was meant to obfuscate his identity to the player, to make it less obvious that Pliskin is actually Snake. Good thing he changed his mind. Otherwise, I barely would have been in the game. Me voicing Pliskin did make it super obvious he's really Snake, though. Kinda spoiled the twist. Remember how Ocelot loses his right hand in MGS1, and then in the sequel he grafts Liquid's arm onto his stump? Kojima wanted Solidus to do that too. At some point, Solidus would, quote, "fire all US nuclear weapons," but doing so could only be achieved with atomic authorization. Kojima's plan was that after President James Johnson died, Solidus would cut off his own right arm and replace it with the president's. Then, he could use that living arm's biometrics to access the nuclear football. Kojima doesn't say why he eventually dropped the idea, but yeah, maybe it would have been a little silly to have 2 right-arm stealing villains in the same game. Who knows? According to the diary, Kojima also planned to increase player freedom and make the game less linear. One example would have been selectable missions, which he kinda didn't want to do, but he felt modern gamers demanded it. In his diary, he wrote, "It'll be possible to select the missions that must be completed mid-game and make them diverge. Snake and Raiden will operate simultaneously. I don't really want to do this, but there's no denying it's a trend in today's gaming landscape. The player can decide which mission to go on in real time, while another mission's automatically done by Snake." The final game was much more linear. You don't get a choice of missions. But Snake does still operate independently, most notably when him and Raiden are defusing Fat Man's bombs. Other player freedoms that Kojima did want to make were inspired by Half-Life, which released shortly after MGS1. Kojima bought a copy for reference while making MGS2, and it had a profound impact on him. He couldn't stop talking about it. "I felt like I'd been outdone by the Americans," he exclaimed. "The scene with the accident in the lab gave me goosebumps. Big Japanese games don't have this kind of soul. Even the cutscenes provide a refined level of freedom, and if I was going to make MGS cutscenes interactive, this is how I'd do it. The ending's incredible." Cutscenes in Half-Life happen in real time, with the player free to walk around and do whatever they want as events unfold. You can even shoot the cutscene's participants. Kojima got a lot of criticism that the first Metal Gear Solid wasn't interactive enough, with some critics accusing it of being more like a movie than a video game. But Kojima ended up deciding Half-Life-style cutscenes wouldn't work in a game as story-heavy as Sons of Liberty. If you shoot Pliskin mid-sentence, the game's pretty much broken. So he came up with a middle ground: split-screen cutscenes. On one side, the cutscene plays out, while gameplay happens on the other, like in that Mexican standoff we mentioned earlier. Kojima was super enthusiastic and determined to patent the idea, but ultimately split-screen mode ended up getting cut. Another development detail, told in the November 18, 1998 entry, is how Kojima came up with character names. After buying a phone book from America, he searched for Sarah Connor to pretend he was in Terminator. But the real reason he bought the phone book was to take real people's names and make them into Sons of Liberty characters. Think Peter Stillman, Richard Ames, and James Johnson. One character, Olga Gerlukovich, didn't come from the phone book though. Olga's name was actually taken from a woman who worked at Konami of Europe. Code names were arrived at a bit differently. Snake's codename Pliskin comes from Kurt Russell's character in the 1981 film Escape from New York, whose name is Snake Pliskin. As for the others, Kojima said, "I want the codenames of the protagonist and Dead Cell to be weapon names this time, like Raiden, Fat Man, and so on. I want the nuance that they're not being treated like people, but strategic pawns." Fat Man was the name of the atomic bomb dropped on Nagasaki. Likewise, Raiden's named after the Mitsubishi J2M Raiden, a Japanese World War II fighter plane that the Allies codenamed Jack, which is why Raiden's real name is Jack. Then, after that was decided, named his girlfriend Rose as a tip of the hat to Titanic. Canonically, Raiden doesn't have a last name, but in one diary entry, Kojima writes down the name Raiden Brannigan. Later, he says Raiden's real name is Fanshawe, a name he took from a character in the novel The Locked Room. Fittingly, The Locked Room's about a writer who steals the identity of a guy named Fanshawe, which is exactly what Kojima did. As for Raiden's dark past as a child soldier, that came about because Kojima just happened to stumble across a program about child soldiers on Japanese television one day. "Good timing," he said. "I think I can use this for Raiden's backstory." Kojima also caught a TV special about the Santa Fe artificial stock market. Basically, an AI stock market developed in real-life New Mexico in the late 90s. Kojima said he was going to add a bit in the game where Otacon uses this virtual stock market to get rich, but didn't end up following through with the idea. So, Otacon stayed poor. Speaking of character names, in the release version, Rose reveals she's pregnant with Raiden's baby. MGS2 never tells us the child's name, but in his diary, Kojima says Raiden's going to name him Dave. In other words, name him after Solid Snake. But years later, when players finally heard the kid's name for the first time, in MGS4, it was John, which is Naked Snake's real name. Kojima also wanted to use more famous licensed songs, which would have cost a lot more than what they ended up using. For example, he intended to open the game with Billy Joel's You May Be Right, and end the game with Frank Sinatra's New York, New York. Instead, he had to settle for this as the opening music. And this for the closing.
The best things in life are free.
He also mentioned he wanted to use OMD's anti-war song Enola Gay for the ending track of MGS1. But his sound director, Kazuki Muraoka, stopped him and said kids these days aren't going to know that track. So they recorded an Irish song instead. The best is yet to come. Can't help but notice all three tracks Kojima originally wanted to use released in the exact same year, 1980. It's unclear if that was meaningful somehow or just coincidence. In another entry, Kojima says he wanted to make swimming underwater physically uncomfortable for the player. You'd have the oxygen gauge, just like normal. But after you run out of air, you'd have to mash the action button like a madman to keep from drowning. The goal is to experience the sensation and pain of holding your breath underwater for real, he said. If you press the button, your range will expand and deepen extensively. Kojima's always sought to bring his games out into the real world, often in some unusual ways. Psycho Mantis reading your mind in MGS1's probably the most famous example. He wanted to go far beyond that though, and when Sony showed him the PlayStation 2 for the first time, he lamented that, quote, "It's not the machine of my dreams. It's got no smell. Needless to say, no flavor either." Much to his disappointment, we may never know what Big Shell smells like at sunrise, or the taste of kissing a girly poster in a soldier's locker. You know, reading through this 4-year diary, we couldn't help but notice how big a toll the game took on him. The stress gave him nausea, body aches, headaches, declining mental health, nightmares, constipation, diarrhea. Practically any stress-induced ailment you can think of, he got it. He was constantly in and out of the hospital all throughout development. A couple of days before Sons of Liberty finally released, he gave his doctor an early pre-release copy as a thank you. A month later, in December 2001, he wrote the very last diary entry saying, "The year of the snake is almost over, but my body still isn't back to normal." That's the diary's final sentence. So besides Kojima sacrificing his health to give us MGS2, there's one last bit of trivia for you. That Sons of Liberty released in the Japanese Zodiac's Year of the Snake. The next Year of the Snake, we got Rising Revengeance, and it looks like the series' long-awaited return might arrive in the next Year of the Snake. Or I don't know, maybe not. Just because I'm Snake doesn't mean they keep me in the loop on scheduling.
Did you know? Much like how some Game Boy games have bonus content when played on a Game Boy Color, several Color games unlock special features when played on a Game Boy Advance. 4 examples of this are Shantae, Wendy, Every Which Way, and both The Legend of Zelda Oracle of Ages and Seasons. When played on a GBA, Shantae has new items and abilities, Wendy, Every Which Way has 3 new levels, and the Oracle's games unlock a special advanced shop where players can buy exclusive items. These last 2 games even comment on the obscurity of the bonus content, with the store's owner Stockwell telling the player, "I'm amazed you found us." The success of the Game Boy line meant it penetrated pop culture and reached new audiences. In 1991, the system found its way to NBA star Lionel Simmons, who developed tendinitis in his right arm due to excessive amounts of Game Boy play. Simmons had to miss 2 basketball games while he was in recovery from hardcore gaming. The Game Boy was popular with more than just athletes, it was also popular with astronauts. The Game Boy was even the first gaming console played in outer space. The system, loaded with a copy of Tetris, was played by Russian cosmonaut Alexander Serebrov. He sent the device back to Earth with a note saying, "During flight, in rare minutes of leisure, I enjoyed playing Game Boy." The console, game, and note were sold in a charity auction for $1,220 in May 2011. Overall, Serebrov's Game Boy spent 196 days in space, orbiting the Earth over 3,000 times. Nintendo's Game Boy released in 1989 and was designed by industry veteran Gunpei Yokoi. Yokoi began developing the system in 1986, but the console's origins date all the way back to 1979. That year, on a train ride home, Yokoi saw a businessman playing with a pocket calculator, randomly pressing buttons to pass the time. It was in that moment Yokoi saw the utility of a handheld video game. At the time, Nintendo almost exclusively made toys, and had only experimented in the video game market with their Color TV game system. But Yokoi had designed several successful toys for Nintendo, and his ideas held a lot of weight at the company. In 1980, Nintendo released Ball, the first title in Yokoi's Game & Watch series, and Nintendo's very first handheld video game. It used a custom-printed LCD screen designed to show predefined characters and objects. Predefined art circumvented the need for dynamic displays using pixels. This saved on the amount of processing power the game needed, and allowed for the handheld to be made using inexpensive components. Other handheld electronic games from that era were mostly card games or sports games, so the Game & Watch series was viewed as a creative new approach with broader appeal. Over the course of 11 years, 59 different Game & Watch titles were produced, selling over 43 million units worldwide. The multi-screen series of the Game & Watch games even inspired the creation of the Nintendo DS. The 1982 port of Donkey Kong for Game & Watch was the first video game to feature the cross-shaped directional pad, or D-pad control scheme. The D-pad earned a Technology and Engineering Emmy Award, and was later patented by Nintendo and used in the NES and Game Boy. The Game Boy was internally called the DMG, or Dot Matrix game. Even though more advanced technology was available, the Game Boy's hardware was chosen to be cost-efficient and use as little power as possible, just like the Game & Watch. The LCD screen of the Game Boy was given a blank green background because, in testing, green contrasted better with the LCD overlay in different levels of light. Yokoi has called his design philosophy lateral thinking of withered technology. Withered technology refers to technology that is older, cheaper, and well understood, and lateral thinking refers to using that old technology in new new and innovative ways. The price point and battery life of the Game Boy gave Nintendo an edge over more powerful handheld systems like the Atari Lynx and the Sega Game Gear, both of which came out around the same time as the Game Boy. Sega in particular seemed to resent the success of the Game Boy and opened one of their Game Gear commercials by showing a Game Boy and stating, "If you were colorblind and had an IQ of less than 12, then you wouldn't mind which portable you had." During the Gulf War, one American soldier's Game Boy withstood an explosion during a bombing raid. The system suffered cosmetic damage, but was still operational. It was even displayed at the Nintendo store in New York City for several years. The Game Boy also crossed cultural boundaries despite government bans. After World War II, South Korea placed an embargo on Japanese products. So in 1990, instead of Nintendo selling the device, Korean company Hyundai did, renaming it the Mini Comboy. Hyundai sold several Japanese consoles under alternative names during this time, including the Genesis, NES, Master System, Game Gear, and Super Nintendo. The first backlit Game Boy wasn't the Game Boy Advance SP, but the Game Boy Light. The Game Boy Light was released in Japan in 1998 and was never sold in any other region. Nintendo had been working on a new Game Boy before the Light was even announced, as early as 1995. It was codenamed Project Atlantis and was based on a 32-bit processor. Magazines at the time suggested it was capable of running Super Nintendo standard games, and rumored that it'd be released in 1997. By the time 1997 came around, though, the console was nowhere to be seen. Instead, Nintendo released the Game Boy Color in 1998 as a stopgap so developers could spend more time working on Project Atlantis, which became the Game Boy Advance. Even though the Game Boy Color was only a modest upgrade over the previous Game Boy, it did add more than just color. The CPU was twice as fast, and it had 4 times the memory of the Game Boy. Another interesting fact is that in the Game Boy Color logo, each letter of the word color represents one of the 5 colors the system originally launched in. Throughout the life of the Game Boy Color, Nintendo experimented with ideas that would become basic features in later hardware releases. The Color was the first gaming handheld to offer wireless communication. The system had an infrared communications port at the top, which used the same technology found in a TV remote. Though it was more primitive than modern wireless connectivity, it was still capable of trading information in games like Pokémon and Harry Potter. The Game Boy Color was also the first Nintendo handheld to have a motion-controlled game. Kirby's Tilt and Tumble was controlled almost entirely by a series of accelerometers that were built into the cartridge, which was a first for video games. The original Game Boy line, including the Game Boy Color, sold 118.69 million units worldwide, and with this success came many innovative and unique peripherals for the Game Boy line of handhelds. There was also a sewing machine that had compatibility with the Game Boy. The Singer iSec sewing machine connected to the game via link cable, and allowed users to design patterns with a special game cartridge. Another obscure accessory for the Game Boy was the iCard cartridge. It was a radio transmitter that would use the Game Boy to display real-time information about times, scores, schedules, and results for the American Le Mans Series races. In 1998, Nintendo released the Game Boy Camera and Game Boy Printer. The Game Boy Camera held the world record of being the smallest digital camera of its time. Singer-songwriter Neil Young released the album Silver and Gold in the year 2000. The album's cover photo was taken with a Game Boy camera. The Game Boy camera also had a few Easter eggs. If the player presses B during the credit sequence, a short video of Shigeru Miyamoto dancing will play. The Game Boy Printer also has an Easter egg. If the device is turned on while the user holds the feed button, an image of Mario with the word hello will be printed on the paper. Nintendo also sold a special Zelda edition of the Game Boy camera through the Nintendo Power magazine. The cartridge was gold rather than black, and many of the graphics and clip art from the original were replaced with Zelda graphics. Another special edition of the Game Boy camera was never released. It was based around the characters and images from the Japanese magazine CoroCoro Comics. Even though it was never released, much of the unique content from this version still exists in the ROM of the original Japanese Game Boy camera. Also on the Japanese version, there's a print icon that shows a syringe. This is because many older printers use syringes to refill their inkjets. However, syringes are often associated with drug use in the West, so the icon was replaced with a Game Boy printer icon in the international versions. Another Game Boy accessory was the Super Game Boy. Super Game Boy was an adapter for the Super Nintendo to play Game Boy games on the TV. What's interesting about the device is that the Super Nintendo didn't have the ability to emulate Game Boy games. Instead, the Super Game Boy itself contained most of the same hardware that was in an actual Game Boy, minus the screen and buttons. Another Game Boy peripheral of sorts was the Game Link cable. The Link cable impacted the world even beyond video games, as it was the basis for Apple's FireWire connectors. Two more bizarre Game Boy peripherals are the Pocket Sonar and the Petty Sedate. The Game Boy Pocket Sonar was made by Bandai for the original Game Boy, and used sonar to locate underwater fish. It was the first sonar-based gaming accessory and retailed in Japan for 14,800 yen, about $115 at the time. It even had a built-in fishing minigame. The Petty Sedate, on the other hand, would connect to a Game Boy device and dole out nitrous oxide to the children playing. Its general purpose was to reduce stress when children needed to be sedated. One unreleased Game Boy accessory was shown by DSi designer Masato Kuwahara at the 2009 Game Developers Conference. It was a touch panel that went over the screen of the Game Boy Color. It was abandoned because it apparently didn't work well without a backlight. The touch panel was attempted again with the Game Boy Advance SP, and operated more favorably because of its backlit screen. Kuwahara stated the touch panel was not well received by Nintendo management, but that Shigeru Miyamoto liked the general concept. Masato Kuwahara said he likes to think his design helped influence the creation of the Nintendo DS.
In this show, we're going to explore games that never made it to the United States. We'll detail what's in the games, and try to shed some light on why they went unpublished stateside. Software that isn't published in the US tends to be part of an obscure franchise, but the title we're covering today comes from one of gaming's best known series, Pokemon. The Pokemon franchise exploded during the 1990s. As with most popular series, Pokemon's creators tried to capitalize on the success of the anime and video games by creating a trading card game. Since the first generation of Pokemon games had already established a battle system, the trading card game's rules took inspiration from the Game Boy games. The card game launched in Japan in 1996 and reached the United States around 2.5 years later. It took America by storm and became a trend amongst the nation's kids. During this 2.5-year gap, a brand new Pokemon game was released in Japan based on the trading cards. A year after this game came out in its home country, it was translated and published in the West as Pokemon Trading Card Game for the Game Boy. Due to the success of the game, a second title was created and released in Japan in 2001. Although many Western fans waited for the second game to be localized, it never made it to the West. Before we get into the details of the second game, we're going to talk a little bit about the first game. Just as the actual card game took inspiration from the original Pokemon games, so does the trading card video game. The player collects a deck of cards from a professor based on the elements of fire, water, or grass. They must compete against various characters in the world. This includes a rival, 8 club leaders based on different elemental types, and 4 card player Grand Masters. The player can also create their own deck with cards obtained throughout the game, and can save the various decks using computers. Although it borrowed many elements from the original games, the Pokemon trading card game also introduced ideas that became a standard for the series. One example is the ability to run by holding in the B button. This was introduced to the core series in Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire, but until the trading card game, no such ability existed for the series. The game featured digitized versions of real cards that were illustrated by Ken Sugimori, Mitsuhira Elita, and Keiji Kinabuchi. There are a total of 228 cards featured within the title, but some of these cards couldn't be obtained without the use of the Card Pop feature. Card Pop allowed 2 players to link up their games using the Game Boy Color's infrared function, which would provide both players with a random card, similar to the mystery gift system found within the core titles. The title was created by Hudson Soft and originally announced under the name of Pokemon Card. The project's Western release was initially delayed by 2 months. It's believed that this was done so Nintendo could focus their marketing on Pokemon Stadium for the Nintendo 64. When the game did release, it came with a promotional card featuring Meowth. This card was only available with the game, and wasn't sold anywhere else in the West. In Japan, a special legendary Dragonite was given away instead, and it was made exclusive for the region. While most cards appear within the title, 2 were missing: Electrode from the base set, and Ditto from the Fossil set. This was due to difficulties getting their abilities to work within the game's engine. As a result, a new card for both of the Pokemon was made exclusively for the game. The Electro card, however, was later made available from an online card shop. The game features 2 cameo appearances in the characters of Mr. Ishihara and Imakuni. These are both the president and CEO of the Pokemon Company, Tsunekazu Ishihara, and Pokemon anime musician Tomoaki Imakuni. Imakuni's appearance with a question mark resembles that of his stage name. The Pokemon trading card game was praised and had successful sales. Over 600,000 copies were sold in Japan by the end of 1999, and around 1.5 million copies were sold in America in its first year. With the growing popularity of the trading card game, it seemed only inevitable that there would be a sequel. With several expansions to the physical card game being made, there was plenty of content to use for another game. Also developed by Hudson, the sequel was titled Pokemon Card GB2 Here Comes Team GR. The game boasted several new features and improvements over the previous title. This included being able to choose your gender, an extensive training mode to educate new players, and a diagnosis system that let the player know how effective their deck would be in use. Many new cards had been published since the first game released. These additional cards were added to the game, bringing its total up to 445 cards. While this number is higher than the original, a large number of cards were left out. The game's story was also expanded, and didn't simply revolve around the player collecting club medals and defeating the Grand Masters. A new rival team appears called Team Great Rocket. Led by King Bilalichi, the team kidnaps a number of the club masters and has stolen almost everybody's Pokemon cards. It's the player's role to save the club masters and defeat Team Great Rocket in their headquarters. As a direct sequel, the game not only allows the player to explore the island found in the first trading card game, but also a second island called GR Island. This made the game's world seem much more fleshed out and improved upon the relatively short length of the first game. New graphical features were added too. Opponents now had a variety of expressions after a duel commenced, such as being happy when winning or sad when losing. Another change was the introduction of coins. These coins are awarded after winning a club match, as opposed to the medals found in the first game. They can even be used to replace the coin shown during coin flips throughout the game. A noticeable difference between the two games is how the entranceway of each gym is presented. Originally, each gym simply had a different symbol to define it. In the second game, the entire room is themed after the gym's elemental type. Another new feature was a game center, which featured several mini-games. These included a game where the player has to flip a coin and land it on heads over and over and over again. Doing it 10 times over unlocks a Mew card. There are also slot machines which have a bonus game attached to them. Unlike in the core series, the slot machine plays itself and has no user input for stopping the reels. As you can see here, we tried many times to get the 3 rainbow icons to line up so that we could play the bonus game. However, we simply couldn't do it. These minigames would grant tokens to the player, and they could be traded for additional cards. While the previous game featured connectivity through the use of the Game Boy's link cable, it isn't possible to connect the original trading card game to the sequel. Battles and trading between generations was a highly praised feature of the core series of Game Boy games, and was expected to be in the second card game too. As a result, when players tried to perform a card pop between the first and second card games, several issues occurred. This included glitches like the game's freezing, or the data from the first game being completely lost. The card pop was once again one of the only ways of obtaining 2 cards within the game, Lugia and Here Comes Team Rocket. Similar to the previous title, a trading card was made to promote the game, Great Rocket's Mewtwo. The card was planned to be bundled with the game, but was packaged with the special edition Celebi Game Boy Advance instead for unknown reasons. Pokemon Card GB2 didn't release in Japan until March 28th, 2001, which was a week after the launch of the Game Boy Advance. This was problematic for the original Game Boy as a platform, as the introduction of new hardware usually means the death of a previous device. The first trading card video game took years to be localized, and the sequel was literally twice its size. The Game Boy Advance released in North America just 3 months after it came out in Japan, so even if the game was localized at breakneck speed, and only took a year to come to the West, it still would have been published on a dying platform. Although the game would have likely seen respectable sales figures, Nintendo probably cut their losses in order to focus on the development and marketing of new Game Boy Advance games. The success of their new hardware would have been far more important to them than the success of a single game. If a console doesn't sell well at launch, it may lack support from other companies, and a lack of games could trigger a snowball effect of poorer and poorer sales on the platform.
Did you know that Volition, the studio behind Red Faction and Saints Row, spent hundreds of thousands of dollars making a PS2 Batman stealth project, but it never saw the light of day? No footage of the game, nor the fact that it even exists, has ever been made public, until now.
Batman demo from September 29, 2003. This demo was developed by Volition, a THQ studio.
Volition was hoping to attach it to an upcoming Batman movie, but unfortunately, things just didn't work out. In this video, we'll show off the demo, but that's not all. We also have some documents for a Zelda-style Crash Bandicoot that never was, and we've got some new info on PS2 classics that did come out, like Final Fantasy and Metal Gear Solid. More on those later, but first, the Batman demo. An individual working within Volition provided us with this demo footage, concept art, and documentation. They're passionate about game preservation and wanted to shed some light on the project with Did You Know Gaming after watching our channel for over a decade. We're flattered. Thank you so much. For obvious reasons, this person wanted to remain anonymous. According to the documents they supplied, the demo was put together from the bones of an even earlier project called Underground, which had earlier gotten cancelled by their publisher THQ. Underground was basically a Mafia game, whose spirit lived on when Volition created the Saints Row franchise. Volition spent over $300 grand for 22 devs to quickly build this demo from Underground's ashes, making it into a Batman stealth game. It feels kinda like Metal Gear, actually, but set in the Batman universe.
Condition green, all clear. Are you alright? Get up!
It goes without saying, if the game went into full production, it would have looked a lot more polished than what you're seeing now. Unfortunately, THQ didn't give them that green light. The demo's pretty dang cool all on its own, with voice acting, stealth kills, Batman's batarangs, binoculars, grapple hook, and a nice little chunk of Gotham City. It was fully playable, but our source wasn't able to get all the required files before Volition got shut down by their new owners, Embracer Group, in 2023. Right in the middle of us talking with them, actually. Closed down forever. It would have been nice to make the playable demo available to the folks watching this, but due to the studio's dissolution, now all that exists of Volition's Batman is some concept art, timesheets, and this 6-minute demo footage. We're gonna move on to some other games now, but if you want to see the full unedited Batman demo, we'll link it to you on the Did You Know Gaming archive at the end of this video.
Ah. That's odd.
Next up, we've got lots of new info on the Crash Bandicoot game Cortex Chaos, which would have been a follow-up to Crash Twinsanity on the PS2. Twinsanity got middling reviews from professional reviewers, but if Metacritic's anything to go by, players themselves thought it was as good as the original trilogy. After Traveler's Tales Oxford finished development on Twinsanity, they pitched a follow-up called Cortex Chaos to their publishers at Vivendi Universal. We'll showcase some concept art and pages from the pitch alongside some developer testimony. We spoke with the project's creative director, Paul Gardner, who told us we only had a few weeks to put the pitch together, but coming off the back of Twinsanity, we really knew the characters and the tone, and production tools, well, so it all came together pretty quickly. We pitched two possible stories, one called The Trials of Cortex, and the other called The Clones of Cortex. Trials of Cortex would have seen the Crash villain standing trial, brought up on charges brought by his evil scientist peers. In their eyes, he'd ruined their reputation by failing to defeat a lowly marsupial. Cortex would argue his view as he defends himself in court, all presented in-game as levels from previous Crash games you'd have to play through as Dr. Cortex. Interactive flashbacks, essentially. Later, Cortex would have to complete a series of challenges to prove his wickedness, or else he'd lose his license to do evil and be condemned to a life sentence working at a summer camp for excessively cute children. Cortex, of course, escapes this fate worse than death and gets revenge on his former evil scientist colleagues. The other story pitch, Clones of Cortex, had a sort of baby-child, big friend situation going on. You'd play as both Dr. Cortex and his niece Nina. By teaming up, you could unlock new gameplay mechanics in the same vein as Crash and Cortex humiliskating. Here's the summary of the pitch document. Quote, Always let down by his bungling henchmen, Dr. Cortex decides to help himself by creating 6 clones to run his affairs. But the clones mutate, each more bizarre and wild than the last. When his creations take over the laboratory, the hapless scientist and his niece Nina must use all their cunning and guile to defeat each of the boss clones and recapture the castle. Delving a bit deeper, Paul Gardner told us that the main new mechanic was Cortex spawning mini clones of himself called duplets. You'd heard them around like lemmings. For example, by blowing one up, the other terrified duplets would run away in the opposite direction. You'd need to get them to the other end of an area to trigger a mechanism so that Cortex could teleport there and progress further into the level. There was also a third idea for Cortex Chaos. This one's sort of a failed pitch within a failed pitch. An idea document the Twinsanity devs cooked up but didn't even make it to the publisher meeting. More specifically, it was written by John McCann, who showed us the document and said, "I really want to work on a Zelda-like game, so that's pretty much the basis of my outline, a Zelda-style game starring Cortex and Nina." It's 19 pages, so we'll flash it on screen for folks who want to pause it and read. But here's the 1-minute summary. Dr. Cortex's laboratory serves as the hub world. It starts off pretty empty because all of his world domination equipment has been stolen, but over the course of the game, he builds that lab back up, filling it with exciting machines and furniture, and new areas of the lab will open up to be explored. Out in the world, he uses a cell phone called the Cortex Communicator, which houses the game's menu and also acts like Navi from Ocarina of Time. Just instead of saying, "Listen," it sends text messages to his lab supercomputer, giving Cortex hints to tell him where to go next. It was 2004, mobile phones were relatively new and microtransactions didn't exist yet, so naturally, players would be able to unlock new ringtones, wallpapers, and casings to customize their communicator. Cortex of course had his laser and other moves, but could also use a melee weapon and shield, and he even had Z-targeting as well. So yeah, it was a Cortex-themed Zelda, more or less. Pushing the select button lets you switch between playing as Cortex and his niece Nina, or you could do 2-player co-op with both characters. Unfortunately, Twinsanity didn't sell well by series standards. Just shy of 1 million fans went out and bought a copy. So publisher Vivendi Universal said no thanks to Traveler's Tales Cortex ideas. The next Crash game didn't end up coming out until the next console generation, with Vivendi handing the franchise over to a different studio, Radical Entertainment, to make Crash of the Titans. It wound up getting lower review scores than even Twinsanity, so no offense to the devs, but maybe things would have worked out better for the publisher if they had just greenlit Cortex Chaos from the start. It's hard to say for sure since they never released the total sales figures for Titans, but the fact that they didn't usually doesn't bode well.
Thank you, Crash. My powers were useless against them.
And now for some new info on a PS2 game that did come out, Final Fantasy X. A story about the young blitzball player Titus who's tasked with escorting the summoner Yuna on her pilgrimage to attain the final Aeon and defeat the antagonistic force known as Sin. To find some new info about a beloved old game, we had to hunt for some old Japanese magazines and have them translated. One interesting tidbit we found comes from the game's scenario writer Kazushige Nojima, revealing where he got a lot of his inspiration. Talking to Famitsu, he said, "This is something I haven't really told anyone before, but when we started on X, I read a lot of letters left by kamikaze pilots and their families. Among them, there was one story about a family taking a pilot to the train station who loved him but knew they were taking him to his death. That kind of resolve and resignation is at the core of X's story." In another interview, this time with Dengeki PlayStation, Nojima said that the game's theme was travel. So they wanted the game to resemble our real world, but not take after Europe like so many games that came before. Something new, something different. Nojima wanted the setting to be based on what he called the Stan countries. You know, like Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan. Games rarely take place in that region. "I was clamoring to go there for research," he told Dengeki, but ultimately art director Yasuki Naora won out, and Spira ended up as a more tropical, Southeast Asia-inspired region instead, like Thailand. Once the devs settled on that more islandy backdrop, they needed to figure out how to get the game's protagonist in the water. Producer Yoshinori Kitase told Famitsu magazine, "So at first Titus's job was an underwater plumber. I envisioned him as a diver on the seafloor or something, and he'd fix the pipes," he laughs. So originally, instead of a blitzball sports minigame, the player would have gone on missions where Titus dives down and fixes pipes. Eventually they decided that a plumber wouldn't make for a good hero. Not big Super Mario fans, we guess. So they changed Titus into an underwater athlete. The overalls in his final design, though, are leftover from that early character archetype. One of the most iconic parts of Final Fantasy X has got to be the oft-memed laughing scene.
probably shouldn't laugh anymore.
According to Nojima, that memorable scene was based on his high school drama club. Him and the other drama kids would climb up to the school's roof and ha 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 out into the open air. Another idea that fell by the wayside was internet functionality. In fact, every time you load up your PS2 save file, you're smacked right in the face with the Play Online branding, a testament to how close these features got to making it into the final game. In another issue of Famitsu, executive producer Sakaguchi explains how it might have worked. That players could trade rare items with each other or just straight up sell them on the server. Play Online would also provide tricks and tips like revealing where rare swords are hidden in the game world. And it was 2001, so of course you could exchange information with other players, send and receive emails, and listen to music with the power of the internet. Ultimately, all the online features got cut and mostly repurposed for Final Fantasy XI instead. But 11 had an interesting cut feature as well, playing in arcades. 11 was released on PlayStation 2 and PC, but before release, Sakaguchi said the game's save data will be stored on a server, so you could play from anywhere. For example, you could play on PS2 at home and then on your PC when you get to work. Then stop by an arcade on your way home and play for 3 minutes for 100 yen. It's true! I'm telling you, it's true! Unfortunately, it wasn't true. You might think that kind of setup could only work in Japan, but some rare promo footage does exist showing Americans playing 11 at an arcade.
Doodle, need you. Where and when?
Yo, Taro, come on, man, we're forming a party.
Not now, man. Ellie needs me.
So it seems they originally wanted to bring it stateside as well, but Final Fantasy XI Arcade never became a reality, even in Japan. Another PS2 classic, Metal Gear Solid 2 Sons of Liberty, was also hard to find new info for. That's partly our own fault, to be honest. Mega popular titles tend to have everything already dug up, but the game's director, Hideo Kojima, did write a development diary that's never been translated before. Well, not in full, anyway. A few facts here and there have been released to the English-speaking world, but most of it hasn't. We looked through all of it, and there's some excerpts we found interesting. In the first Metal Gear Solid, Snake gets tortured and then remains shirtless for a little while until he finds a box with all of his supplies and gets his clothes back on. For the sequel, Kojima wanted to do something similar, but this time pull the rug out from the fans' expectations. In his diary, he said, "Just like in the last game, I'll put a cardboard box next to Raiden when he's naked. Veteran players will grab it and expect to get their equipment back, then Raiden will disappear into the shadows of the torture room, but when he comes back out, he's still completely naked, but has that cardboard box around his waist. Then he'd run around wearing nothing but a box for a while." Kojima thought it would be hilarious, but it was a little difficult from a technical standpoint, so he put it on the back burner, then never came back to it. So in the final game, Raiden just stays naked. Another interesting fact is that Olga was originally supposed to commit suicide by the end of the game. You might remember her Spetsnaz knife, which had a single bullet inside.
Not too shabby, is it? New York, I mean.
That's the bullet she would have used to do the deed, but the script got revised to have her murdered by Solidus instead. Kojima also mentions Arsenal Gear was going to be a giant turtle, but in the final release it ended up being more like a manta ray. Here's probably the weirdest excerpt. In the final game, there's a part where Raiden swims underwater with Emma Emmerich. Nothing too unusual happens, but while they're underwater, Kojima originally wanted blood seeping out of Emma's crotch. When they surface, Raiden would ask, "Where are you hurt?" And Emma would blush and say, I'm fine." Later in the story, Emma is fatally stabbed by Vamp. Raiden's audibly concerned with how much blood she's losing, and then she'd look up and say, "I'm fine, it's just my period," then let out her final breath. Those would have been her dying words, but Kojima's team all hated the idea, so all those menstrual gags got cut out. Kojima's diary also includes a weird unused idea for Zone of the Enders, a space robot game he was making around the same time. He said, "The cockpits are located in the waist, so I'll call them dick seats, and they'll get erect when the robots use special moves. I want it to be slang in this world to say, 'Aim for the enemy's dick!' That, didn't make it in either." We're currently having the diary fully translated, which is almost 100 pages long converted into English, and we'll cover all the highlights in an upcoming Metal Gear video, so subscribe if you don't want to miss it.
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. Today we'll be looking at chip art on video game hardware, as well as chip art of video game characters on other electronics. For those who don't know, chip art is a piece of art on a computer chip, also known as silicon art, and if Wikipedia is to be believed, silicon doodling. The art is typically too small to make out with the naked eye, although there are some exceptions to this. Circuit boards aren't exactly the canvas that jumps to mind when thinking of how to express creativity, but their art certainly shouldn't be overlooked. And with video game hardware having a lot of circuit boards and chips, there are many potential canvases waiting to be filled by artists. The most famous example of chip art in video games is probably the dolphin jumping over Nintendo's logo. This art is within the GameCube system itself, and is a reference to GameCube's project name, Dolphin. However, more modern consoles also contain art on their circuit boards. Although it's multiple times larger than Nintendo's hidden dolphin, an etched graving of a super deformed Master Chief riding a scorpion can be found inside every Xbox One X console. Take our word for it, don't start prying your consoles open. This silicon doodling references the updated console's codename during development, Project Scorpio. The Scorpion itself may also be a reference to the vehicle found within the Halo universe, the Scorpion. This sort of art can also be found on game cartridges. Another piece of art on a circuit board can be found inside the cart for Mickey Mouse Cuphead on the original NES. The art is a simple soldering of the famous Mickey Mouse head silhouette. Going back to much smaller art, but slightly forward in time, the Atari Simplified Architecture Processor, or ASAP, was a chip used in some of Atari's 90s arcade titles, like the unreleased platformer Beathead. The chip has a tiny etching of a Lotus 7 car, which according to Atari's Michael Alber, was to symbolize the chip's comparatively impressive speed for its price range. Arcade games seem to go hand in hand with chip art. Probably the best known arcade-era character, Pac-Man, can be found on Temec semiconductors eating the initials GAAS, which is short for gallium arsenide. The kind of chip that Pac-Man is printed on were cheaper than the gallium arsenide devices which were commonly used. It can be inferred that Pac-Man biting the GAAS is a metaphor for the new, more affordable chips gobbling up the competition and its inferior gallium arsenide. While all that tech talk was terribly interesting, some chip art is just for the fun of it and doesn't symbolize anything in particular. This can be seen with the Infineon TLE8718SA. Although the chip doesn't have much to do with video games, it has chip art of a weird-looking bootleg Mario with a W instead of an M on his hat, as well as the text, Super Wiesner. Possibly the worst piece of chip art we'll be looking at today, or the best, I suppose, depending on how you look at it, is of Mario's rival, Sonic the Hedgehog. The Analog Devices ADSP2181 is a digital signal processor that can be used for rendering all kinds of digital media, like audio, still images, and video. This seems ironic considering how bad the rendering of the art on the chip is, resembling the Sonic meme as much as Sonic himself. And now it's time for this episode's random piece of trivia. Today we'll be looking at the bizarre 1990 beat-em-up Michael Jackson's Moonwalker for the Sega Genesis. Like Jackson himself, the game is known for its music, and when the game came out, fans were looking forward to hearing lo-fi Sega renditions of their favourite MJ tracks. This includes the best-selling track Thriller, which was originally intended to be used as background music for the game's Cemetery level, but it didn't appear in the final game. Although the song was planned to be included, it was replaced by a different Jackson song, Another Part of Me. It's speculated that this is due to Thriller being written by Rod Temperton and not Jackson himself. A small handful of people were aware that the early version of the game included Thriller as the Cemetery theme, but a physical cartridge wasn't discovered until September 15th, 2017. This is when a collector by the online handle of Brian the Hedgehog bought a prototype cartridge at a flea market for $20 and uploaded a YouTube video showing off the track as it appeared in-game. The cartridge is dated April 24th, 1990, 3 months prior to the game's initial release.
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. In today's episode, we'll be exploring stories that developers have told about themselves or colleagues. While some video game developers are well known, most of them remain in obscurity, being overshadowed by their creations. Because of this, stories about how developers experience their own games and profession get comparatively much less coverage in games media. Today, we're changing the tide a little by sharing an interesting handful of their stories. We're starting off with the story surrounding Metroid Prime 2 Echoes, and the game's producer, Brian Walker. In an interview with IGN, Brian disclosed his favorite and least favorite bosses in the game, which are the Quadraxis and the Boost Guardian, respectively. The Boost Guardian was his least favorite because he couldn't actually beat it. In the interview, Brian confessed that he could only beat the boss while in debug mode, where he was able to give himself advantages players wouldn't normally have. While Brian didn't want to make the boss easier for himself, some other developers aren't as selfless. In an interview with Yomi Uri Online, game designer Koji Nishino revealed that the reason why Pikachu was somewhat hard to find in Viridian Forest was because of his own desires towards the character. Nishino said, "This is embarrassing, but since I like Pikachu so much, I get this feeling of not wanting to let other people have Pikachu. At first, I even considered simply hiding Pikachu. As a result, the opposite happened when strategy guides and such had stuff written like, 'First, catch a Pikachu.' And before I knew it, everybody had Pikachu, and my plan completely backfired." Developers at the Pokemon Company aren't the only ones that can be a bit devious, but this next example was for a good reason. While developing Super Smash Bros. For 3DS and Wii U, voice actor Xander Mobus was brought in to be the game's announcer. During recording sessions, Nintendo would throw in characters that were never considered for the game for Xander to read. This was an effort by Nintendo to prevent the game's roster from leaking, with the idea being that no one truly knew who was and was not in the game. Xander told YouTuber Mason of Delfino, "I didn't know the final roster for Smash Bros. They were very tricky. They gave me a lot of red herrings in the script. Some of them were really obvious, but some of them weren't so obvious. I thought Duck Hunt, I was like, what the hell, are you gonna put the cartridge in the game? Come on, who do they think they're fooling with Duck Hunt?" Then he's in the game, and because of that, I had no idea. Some developer stories are a bit more action-packed. According to the David Kushner book, Masters of Doom, John Romero once accidentally locked himself in his office while developing Doom. Romero cried out to his fellow developers to help free him, and after a few attempts of opening the door, Doom programmer John Carmack remembered that he had a real-life battle axe in his office. Carmack had paid $5,000 for the custom-made weapon, and was eager to try it out. Developers began to gather around Carmack chanting, "Battle Axe! Battle Axe! Battle Axe!" And Carmack hacked away at the door until Romero was free. Meanwhile, at Nintendo, the lives of developers are a lot less exciting. In an editorial from The New Yorker, it was revealed that Nintendo are somewhat overprotective of their golden boy and creator of Mario, Shigeru Miyamoto. As it turns out, Nintendo prohibits Miyamoto from either walking or biking to work, and ask him to drive instead. This is because he's become an invaluable asset to the company, and they fear that he might get hit by a motorist if he commutes to work outside the safety of a vehicle. This may sound strange, but other Nintendo veterans such as Gunpei Yokoi met their untimely end in a very similar way. And now it's time for this episode's random piece of trivia. Today we're looking at the meme-worthy game Zero Wing, notorious for its poor English translation. What's interesting about the game, besides its poor localization, is that the Japanese version has an additional 32 endings not seen in the English release. No official explanation has been given as to why these extra endings were removed. However, considering that these endings rely heavily on unusual speech patterns and Japanese pop culture references, and factoring in the already poor quality of the English localization, it's possible that either the localization team didn't translate the endings because it was beyond their ability, or because they were under time or budgetary constraints. Hello, and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. In this bonus episode, we'll be looking at some interesting instances of theft in gaming history. And with that said, on to the trivia. Whether we're talking about IP, software, or physical products, Nintendo are fairly protective of their creations. Unfortunately for them, there are some situations where you just have to accept loss. One such event happened to Nintendo in May 2015, where an entire truck full of special edition Splatoon games was stolen during a heist. The vehicle was commandeered at some point while it was hauling its cargo from Nintendo's European headquarters. The truck was carrying gaming retailer Games' entire shipment of Splatoon's special edition release for Wii U. which left them with no option but to offer a substitute to customers. People who had pre-ordered the game could choose between the standard edition of the game with a discount or to cancel their pre-order altogether. A Nintendo UK spokesperson told Eurogamer, "We can confirm that the lorry transporting the Splatoon stock from Nintendo's European warehouse to Game UK has been stolen. Whilst these unfortunate circumstances were out of Nintendo UK and Game's control, we apologize for any inconvenience or disappointment that this has caused." In September 2007, in the city of Leeuwarden in the Netherlands, a 13-year-old boy was threatened with violence by two other boys aged 14 and 15 in demand of his amulet and mask from the free-to-play MMORPG RuneScape. The two were subsequently convicted in 2009, but in 2012, one of the thieves took to the Dutch Supreme Court with an appeal on the grounds that they hadn't stolen anything, as the virtual items did not exist. The court upheld the conviction and gave him 144 hours of community service on the grounds that the items must have some value, as the boy had invested time and energy in obtaining them while playing the game. Threats and violence aren't the only way of convincing others to give access to their equipment, however. In 2009, a man in Somerset was given a police caution when he obtained a large number of account details for users of RuneScape, which he had obtained through a phishing scam, getting the details from unsuspecting players through a fake website. A policy agreement with RuneScape, as with many online games, requires the player to not trade items in the game for real-world gain. However, on July 22, 2012, 19-year-old Humza Barjava organized a deal with Jonathan Dockler, a student from Fordham University, to receive 5 billion coins in RuneScape in exchange for $3,300. Barjava was unwilling to do bank transfers, and said he'd only make the exchange with cash and in person. Dockler sent his friend, David Imani, to the exchange while he waited by his computer, ready to transfer the goods. At the meeting, Barjava transferred the money he was carrying from one envelope to another, a move that David spotted to be out of the ordinary. David backed out of the deal quickly, calling Jonathan to ensure that he hadn't gone through with the deal. Jonathan then convinced David to try again the next day. This time, David was prepared, bringing a $100 bill to compare with fake notes. David saw that Barjava's money was indeed illegitimate, and Barjava responded with a BB gun, threatening them into making the transfer. David told the New York Post, "I couldn't believe I was about to get shot over RuneScape. I was so scared I was about to die." He called Jonathan and told him to make the transfer. Humza Barjava was later caught after checking surveillance footage. But RuneScape isn't the only game that suffers from scandalous skullduggery. In February 2005, Legend of Mir 3 player Chiyu Changwei allowed another player, Chu Xiaoyuan, to borrow a dragon saber. Xiao Yuan promptly sold the saber for 7,200 yuan, which at the time roughly equated to $870. When Changwei didn't receive his sword back, he reported the incident with the police. But at the time, there were no laws relating to the theft of virtual property, so nothing could be done. Chu Xiaoyuan said that he would give the money to Changwei, but with less than a month having gone by, Changwei grew impatient. He subsequently stabbed Chu Xiaoyuan in the chest, resulting in death. Changwei gave himself into the police and confessed to intentional injury. He was sentenced to life in prison, though his time was reduced due to good behavior. Sometimes a company can fight back against thieves online, as was the case with Blizzard and Diablo 3. For a time, Blizzard included an online auction house within Diablo 3 to provide a convenient and secure method of trading items for in-game gold. The auction house was split into two. One half allowed players to buy and sell with in-game currency, and the other allowed for buying and selling with real-world money. Blizzard games had, for a while, been used for real-world profit. Gold farming in World of Warcraft was considered a real job in many places, with, at one point, over 100,000 people being full-time gold farmers in China, obtaining gold in the game to sell for real money outside of Blizzard's control. With Blizzard's introduction of a real money auction house within Diablo 3, they hoped it would make buying and selling items more secure, and also make Blizzard a little commission on each sale. However, it also introduced a solid, tangible, real-world value to their virtual items. In 2012, the same year of the game's release, two players decided to use illicit means to steal items from others. According to court documents, Californian Patrick Nepomuceno and Michael Stinger of Maryland stole and sold over $8,000 worth of items from players through the use of a remote access tool, or RAT, disguised as a link to an image of a rare item. The duo would send the link to other players and have their character drop all of their valuables only for their own Demon Hunter character to swing by and collect everything that had been dropped. After 20 to 30 players afflicted by the thefts reported the cases to Blizzard, they had their items replaced by the company, and the theft was taken to prosecutors. At the time, Michael Stinger was 21 and claimed that the two-man operation had gone on for a few months, but that he had no idea he was sharing malware or that Patrick Nepomuceno was remotely accessing the victims' computers. Splinter News contacted Stinger, who said, "He just told me to share the link and I would get free items. I thought Patrick was doing some glitch. I didn't really care, lol. I was getting free stuff. I was not driven for the money. I simply wanted to get better gear for my character, good weapons and armor." Later in December 2012, FBI agents raided his home, seized his computer, and accused him of committing a felony. Federal prosecutor Tracy Wilkerson, who worked on the case, claimed that because Blizzard replaced the items, they had to find some other means of calculating the value Blizzard had lost in the ordeal. Wilkerson said, "Blizzard gave the victims the goods back. That made the loss calculation difficult, as the victims were reimbursed. So instead, we calculated the perpetrator's gain." Prosecutors claimed that the goods were sold for over $8,000, making the crime a felony, a claim that Stinger disputes. He said, "We made $0. We had plenty of high-value items that we were going to sell, yes. Perhaps the items were valued at $9,000. But nothing was sold and no currency exchanged hands. I got banned before I could sell anything." The bigger issue was not the financial element, but the means in which the items were obtained, unauthorized impairment of a protected computer. This is a misdemeanor which the pair both pled guilty to in 2014. They were given 2 and 3 months probation and were forced to pay Blizzard $5,654.61 to reflect the cost of the company's investigation. Wilkerson blames the issue on an extension of online crime in general, saying, "People think they are not going to get caught, that they're not going to be found in their bedrooms on a computer. They don't think it's that big of a deal." Gaming especially lends itself to this suspension of reality. The auction house was closed in 2014, as Blizzard deemed the system to undermine the game's loot-based mechanics. And now it's time for this episode's random piece of trivia. Today we're looking at Condemned: Criminal Origins, which released for PC and Xbox 360. In the Xbox 360 release, a total of 970 points could be earned for a player's gamer score through achievements, while most games have a total of 1,000 points. It's rumored that the game was set to receive DLC, which would add the additional 30 points to the game's total. But these never came to fruition. This isn't the only game to have under 1,000 gamerscore, however, as during the early life cycle of the 360, Microsoft had not yet laid out guidelines on how the system should be used. It was eventually decided that these rules would have retail games reward a player of 1,000 gamerscore with a total of 50 achievements, allowing for expansion through DLC to up the figure to a maximum of 1,750 points and 80 achievements, though only allowing an additional 250 points and 10 achievements per quarter.
Here's a real high-class belt. And begin!
Did you know? Brothers and Cuphead creators Chad and Jared Moldenhauer always had the idea of making a game of their own, though they lacked the resources to do so for many years. After seeing the success of the indie scene in 2010, especially with games like Super Meat Boy and Castle Crashers, the two realized it was possible for them to make a quality game, and development on Cuphead entered its early stages soon after. From the start, the gameplay was inspired by run-and-gun games like Contra and Gunstar Heroes, but the game's eventual look was rooted in 1930s cartoons, notably from the works of Fleischer Studios. The brothers grew up watching cartoons from the era through VHS tapes they got themselves or as gifts. The duo figured that, as technology improved, someone would make a game in that style, but no one attempted it to the degree they hoped for. The idea of 1930s visuals actually began as a joke they'd shoot around in brainstorming sessions, thinking they'd be unable to pull pull the look off successfully, they dabbled in other styles but always came back to that idea. Despite their lack of training, it was something that resonated with them and they dove right into it. When thinking of designs for the game's protagonist, there had been hundreds of ideas drawn up, but nothing was working for them at first. They wanted to steer clear of animals due to how common they were in platformers, opting for something they could call their own. A lightbulb character fittingly led to the idea of more inanimate objects for heads and led to them being more experimental with their designs. Near the end of the process, Chad would study background elements in cartoons for anything he could find, and over time they came to the design we now know. The design's also said to have roots in a 30s Japanese propaganda film that featured a man with a teacup head. Some of the scrapped ideas showed up in the final game as NPCs such as the axe and applehead designs, and Mugman's character came from the desire of a two-player dynamic. Being the younger brother, Jared said he always identified as Luigi, and they wanted to give off a Mario Brothers vibe with the duo. The game started out simple and was planned to have 8 bosses in a similar structure to the Mega Man series. However, with its popularity at trade shows, the two felt the need to expand the game to feature more content, what they originally envisioned before scaling back. It resulted in the team and development time increasing, but they were still set on seeing it to the end. The game's animation process was said to slow down production by 80% when compared to doing it digitally. They stuck with it because they wanted to be as true to the art style as they could, and to help keep traditional animation alive. It was even considered to color everything by hand, but it only would have gone to add years to production time. The style lent itself to the gameplay due to the wild, eccentric nature of 30s cartoons, leading to near endless possibilities for boss ideas. That said, before coming up with a boss, they needed to know how it'd play out in advance. Depending on its size or location, they designed it with that in mind, coupled with the theme of where they'd appear in the game. There was one idea where a boss would be fought on a sheet of music, with the patterns relying on the level's actual soundtrack. This idea didn't get off the ground as the pattern couldn't be changed once implemented, plus the track had to be different for each of the game's difficulty settings. Despite the pushbacks in the 4 years since its first announcement, the game proved popular through it all, selling over 1 million copies in its first 2 weeks. The studio took many chances throughout development, but took things in small steps before getting to the game's current scope. Jared has said that had they known just how much work would go into Cuphead from the start, they likely never would have made it. Cuphead's development was an intimate affair. Spouses, cousins, and friends of the brothers lent their talents to help bring it to life, being as passionate as they were about the project and gaming as well. The game's composer, Chris Madigan, was a friend of the brothers since childhood and was their go-to guy, knowing he could deliver on the soundtrack they needed. That said, the game was also a first for Madigan. Though he had studied jazz, he didn't consider it his strong suit, on top of doing little actual composing beforehand. Game tracks often loop at a point in their songs, but for Cuphead, Madigan wanted each piece to be as long as it needed to be, even if the player wouldn't hear the full piece in-game. Though there were limitations to how the music could interact with the action on screen, a staple of classic cartoons, Madigan instead went for the vibe of excitement and unpredictability, complementing the game's nature. Each piece also has several different mixes and solos. When one was recorded, they'd have soloists play over the finished piece, with a variety of instruments and improvised segments. Because of this, when fighting the same boss again, a slight variation on their theme can be heard. There are a few nods to other video games in Cuphead's score. The Funfair Fever track has a similar segment to the athletic theme from Super Mario World. This bit, according to Madigan, was a crazy coincidence. If I did it on purpose, I would totally own it, but it's actually a fairly standard ragtime cliche in some ways. When Koji Kondo used it, it was already old. For a game that's full of homages, that was a total accident. The Mario series helped influence another track more directly. The Elder Kettle's theme was initially made for a possible water world that was cut from the final product. Madigan looked to Koji Kondo's method of scoring for water levels in the Mario Brothers soundtrack 33 1/3 book, noting that many are based on waltz numbers. Coincidentally, a master class he attended was covering how to write waltzes, and he saw it fitting to make one. There are dozens of references to games and animation sprinkled throughout Cuphead, with the team wanting them to act more as subtle nods than direct shoutouts. Goopy Legrand's look was inspired by early RPGs where enemies were commonly slime creatures, and was in Cuphead before their own boss formula. The third phase of Dramatic Fanatic is another nod to JRPGs, with Sally's stage plays cutout bearing a striking resemblance to Kefka from Final Fantasy VI. Grim Matchstick has roots in Mega Man 2's Mecha Dragon Boss, and his name references animator Grim Natwick. who worked on many Fleischer cartoons and, like Matchstick, spoke with a pronounced stutter. Dr. Call shares his surname with one of Disney's 9 old men, Milk Call, and the level Perilous Pier shows a building named Hotel Iwerks, referencing animator and co-creator of Mickey Mouse, Ub Iwerks. Baroness von Bonbon has design roots in not only cartoons, but also in actresses from the era, such as Betty Grable, Bebe Daniels, and Loretta Young. The Railroad Wrath bosses all have ties to Japanese yokai. The ghost with Tenome, a ghost with eyes on their hands, the skeleton with Gashadokuro, a giant skeleton, the train pistons possibly with long neck yokai such as Rokurokubi, and the head of the train with Oboroguruma, ox carts with faces that appear in the dead of night. The stage also draws parallels with Final Fantasy VI's Phantom Train, as both have the player make their way through a haunted train before fighting the train itself. The level Clip Joint Calamity is one huge shout out to the Street Fighter series. Ribby and Croak start the fight with Ryu and Ken's taunts, and their moves reference other fighters, from E Honda's 100-hand slap, Guile's Sonic Boom, Dhalsim's Yoga Fire, and even Blanca's Roll. Their slot machine phase references the Street Fighter II bosses, with US Balrog depicted by the machine itself, and Vega, Sagat, and M. Bison by the slot patterns, as it shows snakes, tigers, and bulls respectively. Lastly, when the player dies to the devil in his second phase, his death quote will be, "Anyone who opposes me will be destroyed," which is directly lifted from M. Bison's Game Over quote in Street Fighter II.
Did you know? Rayman has no arms or legs because, during development, programmers had trouble rendering his limbs while the character was in action. The design, with Rayman's hands and feet floating separately from his body, led to the discovery of unique gameplay elements, like the ability to punch enemies from a distance. Rayman was created by Michael Ancel in Montpellier, France. Ancel started developing Rayman for the Super Nintendo with a team of 2. It was originally a co-op platformer with 2 playable Rayman-type characters. As the staff grew, development shifted to focus on CD-ROM-based consoles for their larger storage capacity, and then professional cartoonists were hired to rework the game's graphics and artwork. Rayman's personality as an adventurer with a sense of humor was inspired by Indiana Jones. The designs of the scenery in the levels and worlds were influenced from Celtic, Russian, and Chinese fairy tales, while the designs of the characters were inspired by the Golden Age American animation of Tex Avery. According to an interview in the French magazine Pix and Love, Ancel took the name Rayman from ray tracing software that he used in the Ubisoft studio during the development of the original game. Like the original Rayman, Rayman 2 began development as a 2D platformer. New enemy and ally encounters were created using pre-rendered graphics similar to Donkey Kong Country, and Rayman was going to be able to mount a Tyrannosaurus Rex. The PlayStation release of Rayman 2, The Great Escape, contains a hidden bonus level that is thought to be an early build of the game. At some point though, the Ubisoft development team decided to turn Rayman 2 into a 3D platformer, but there was a problem. Ubisoft had never developed a game like that before. Popular 3D platformers like Super Mario 64 and Crash Bandicoot had already hit the market, and standards for the genre were high. Ancel and the team decided to take a break from Rayman 2 and began working on a side project. This new game was called Tonic Trouble, and it was created to test the engine for the upcoming 3D Rayman game. It also provided an opportunity for the developers to learn the ropes of 3D game development. Tonic Trouble has a few scattered references to Rayman, like the cave painting in the first level and a brief cameo during the credits. Rayman Arena has a reference to Tonic Trouble in a cutscene, where the skeleton of Ed is seen shackled in the background. Ed's face can also be seen in an episode of the Rayman animated series. The Nintendo 64, Dreamcast, and PC versions of Rayman 2 contain a total of 1,000 yellow lums. After a cutscene where Razorbeard eats a yellow lum, the heads-up display for lums changes from 1,000 to 999. However, fans later discovered a hidden yellow lum in the Tomb of the Ancients level that exists even after the player recovered 999 out of 999 yellow lums, bringing the total back up to 1,000. The PlayStation version of Rayman 2 only contains 800 yellow lums, and the lum that Razorbeard eats in the cutscene is changed to a red lum. There are many different versions of Rayman 2, and each one has unique differences. The Japanese version changed Rayman's torso from purple to blue. This is because in Japanese culture, purple is seen as the color for death, often used by villains. It is likely that the change was to assert Rayman as the game's hero. Other characters went through design changes as well. Sam the Water Snake was changed from purple to green, Jano's hat was changed to red, and Lee the Fairy's design was changed completely. There are differences between versions of Rayman 3 as well. The PlayStation 2 release has different music for the fight with Begoniacs. Rayman 3 has a hidden reference to Star Trek during the first teensy highway level. Near the O in the word love in the background, a silhouette of the Starship Enterprise can be seen partially obscured by the heads-up display. One secret room in the Headlum headquarters contains statues of Razorbeard and his minions from Rayman 2, sitting in the style of The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci. Dialogue in Rayman 3 frequently breaks the fourth wall.
Ever played a video game before? Bug off, fairy! Zelda needs you! You were nicer in Rayman 2. See you in Rayman 4!
What's interesting about that last one is that a game called Rayman 4 was never released, but there really was a Rayman 4 in development. It was being produced by Phoenix Interactive Entertainment, and some concept art reveals that it would have had costume transformations like Rayman 3. In 2012, more concept art made its way online, revealing that this game was going to return many of the locations from the first Rayman, like Bandland and Picture City. A different take on a sequel to Rayman 3 emerged in the form of a trailer at E3 2006. It depicted Rayman changing costumes and fighting a swarm of rabbids in the style of a beat-em-up, like Dynasty Warriors. Still images released online show Rayman riding several types of animals trying to escape the army of rabbids. This game, of course, became the minigame collection, Rayman Raving Rabbids, but it's interesting that the game originally started as a 3D platformer. Some other Ubisoft games have references to Rayman in them. Prince of Persia Warrior Within has Rayman's glove as an equipable weapon. It's indestructible and will knock down enemies when thrown at them. Rayman's popularity reached outside of gaming when it was announced that Rayman would be the mascot of the French Federation of Football for the 2014 World Cup.
Did you know? Over the course of The Simpsons' 28 seasons, the show has lent its name to even more games. The first Simpsons game, Bart vs. the Space Mutants, was released in 1991 and closely resembles the plot of John Carpenter's 1988 film They Live. In the film, professional wrestler Rowdy Roddy Piper finds sunglasses that allow him to see aliens disguised as humans. Similar to They Live, Bart finds X-ray specs that reveal aliens disguised as humans. And just like in the film, Bart has to convince everyone that aliens exist. The game was released on many different platforms, including the NES, Atari ST, Sega Master System, and the Amiga. From July 1991 to September 1992, various Amiga bundles came with the cartoon classics, which included Bart vs. the Space Mutants. For the Amiga version of the game, Arc Development wanted to make a new intro that better reflected the show's animation. Although each frame was sent to and edited by Simpsons creator Matt Groening, the animation still looked mediocre compared to the show. Another early entry was the Simpsons arcade game developed by Konami and tested by Konami of America near Chicago. Following the success of the 1989 Ninja Turtles arcade game, Konami took the Turtles beat-em-up gameplay and applied it to The Simpsons. While there's plenty of familiar content in the game, fans noticed some stark difference from the show. While the Simpsons family sounded like they did on TV, Mr. Burns and Smithers sounded nothing like their characters. This is because Harry Shearer, who voiced over 20 characters including Burns and Smithers, didn't voice any of the game's characters. This is most noticeable during the final boss fight.
Welcome to your grave.
Similarly, fans noticed a lack of another prominent voice, Hank Azaria. Azaria's absence meant that characters such as Moe and Otto were uncharacteristically quiet throughout the game. It's unknown whether their omission was due to availability, budget, or technical constraints. A gag that Konami included in the game were rabbits from Groening's first successful publication, Life in Hell. Published from 1977 to 2012, the comic strip involved anthropomorphic rabbits covering a wide range of themes. While some of the rabbits in the arcade games are enemies, there's another nod to the comic. If Marge is electrocuted, her skeletal silhouette has a pair of rabbit ears. According to Groening, he originally planned for Marge's hair to conceal a pair of large Life in Hell-esque rabbit ears. The ears were set to be revealed in Season 1's finale, but Groening decided to scrap the idea. Another interesting detail is that the Japanese game was notably easier than the international version. The usage of weapons was tweaked and the player's health could go past 100%. Even more surprising is the inclusion of arbitrarily placed atomic bombs, which only appear in the Japanese game. In February of 2012, both Xbox Live and PlayStation Network re-released the Simpsons arcade game. Unfortunately, the title was ultimately removed from both console stores and has not returned. In the early 90s, Bart's Nightmare was published on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis to a lukewarm reception. The game's designer, Bill Williams, was a celebrated developer with several acclaimed titles under his belt. Williams suffered from cystic fibrosis and spent much of his time thinking of new ways to experience games. Although he started making out experimental indie games, Williams would eventually take an office job making licensed games at Sculptured Software. While working on Bart's Nightmare, Bill would constantly have to rework the game so it fit executive demands. These orders came from the management of his studio, the Simpsons license holders, and even Nintendo. Unhappy with the corporate environment of the industry, Williams walked away from the project when it was nearly completed. He quit the game industry and enrolled in the Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. His goal was to become a pastor, help people, and gain a stronger connection with the world. Sadly though, Williams passed away at the age of 37 due to his condition. The show itself is well known for parodying pop culture, and this is true for the Simpsons games as well. One of the series' lesser-known games, Virtual Springfield, has a secret mini-game within the Quickie Mart. As a Pooh, the player must fight hoodlums using a broom, a shotgun, and an overpowered weapon. With its gibs and presentation, the mini-game is an obvious parody of Doom. Some of the games also reference movies. Krusty's Funhouse, for instance, has a password system, with most passwords being the names of Simpsons characters. In the title Super Nintendo version, however, one of the passwords is Joshua, a reference to the Cold War hacking movie War Games. These parodies and references were taken to a new level in the 2000s. In 2005, EA acquired exclusive rights for the Simpsons license. The license acquisition was significant as it was the first time Fox ever agreed to a long-term exclusive Simpsons game deal. The Simpsons has always been known for its jabs at pop culture, but the new partnership gave rise to a plethora of possible game references. In an interview with Game Almighty, lead designer Greg Rizza stated that he was excited to parody and poke fun at the industry. Unfortunately, not all game developers approved of their properties being parodied though. During the 2007 Games Convention in Leipzig, Rockstar wasn't happy with Grand Theft Scratchy posters being displayed while they showed off Grand Theft Auto 4. Rockstar ultimately asked EA to pull the posters down. In an interview with CVG, Rizza commented, "I was always under the impression that when you do a parody, it's a sign of respect. If we make fun of Grand Theft Auto, we're not doing it to hurt the sales of Grand Theft Auto. We've definitely had some reactions. We've had to pull stuff from the game." However, other companies like Harmonix and Capcom embraced parodies such as Sitar Hero and Mega Mole Man X. The developers used regular Simpsons show writers Tim Long, Matt Selman, and Matt Warburton to create over 8,000 lines of dialogue for the game. Rizza referred to the Simpsons game as the first playable season of The Simpsons. While the game was the best received in the franchise, things took a sharp turn when EA released The Simpsons Tapped Out. Shortly after the title was released, it was pulled from the iOS App Store due to several problems. This included issues connecting to the servers, excessive bugs, and missing in-app purchases. As a freemium game, Tapped Out received criticism for its exploitative revenue structure and lack of gameplay. The phenomenon of freemium games led to them being mocked in a 2014 episode of South Park entitled Freemium Isn't Free, where the show's Terrence and Phillip app bears an uncanny resemblance to the layout of Tapped Out. The episode reveals the cycle of enticing players to spend real money to buy in-game currency in order to avoid waiting.
Did you know? While Ape Escape is well known as the first PlayStation game to require the DualShock analog controller, it didn't actually start development that way. Creative producer Susumu Takasuka stated in a promotional interview, "Just as we began development on design and concept of this game, we were invited to attend a development meeting for the DualShock analog controller. We were excited to see prototypes with 2 analog sticks. There weren't any games that existed at the time that used both sticks, and we were so intrigued by the new opportunities. The ideas just kept coming." The unconventional control scheme was the result of over 2 years of development. Executive producer Shuhei Yoshida stated that designing the controls was the biggest challenge. The game required an extensive amount of playtesting, and after all the changes, he was surprised to see how much of the original concept the team was able to retain. Shuhei Yoshida has been involved in many high-profile PlayStation games, including Gran Turismo, Parappa the Rapper, Crash Bandicoot, and God of War. During a Q&A at EGX 2015, Yoshida stated that Ape Escape was his favorite game to work on in terms of hands-on development. The iconic soundtrack of the game was composed by DJ and electronic music artist Soichi Terada. Ape Escape director Masamichi Seke was inspired by Terada's track Sumo Jungle and asked Terada to create the background music for the game. Terada's style of music was uncommon in Japan at the time due to a ban on dancing that was enacted after World War II. Soichi Terada developed his musical taste DJing in small clubs in odd locations where the music was played quietly and stopped at midnight. Terada stated that he does not change his style when composing music for video games as opposed to composing music to release under his own label, Far East Recordings. Ape Escape's game data contains some unused assets that were likely from early builds of the game. These assets are animated sprites for the cookies and t-shirt items, both of which are 3D models in the final version. The cookie graphic has the word kakeru on the front, which is the original Japanese name for Spike. The t-shirt has a different appearance than the final version, with horizontal stripes rather than a single vertical stripe, possibly indicating an earlier character design for the protagonist. Fans and speedrunners have also discovered some unused behavior relating to the passing cars in the TV tower level. Using an infinite jump glitch with the slingshot item makes it possible to pass the barriers at the beginning of the level. If the usually unreachable cars beyond the barrier hit Spike, they kill him instantly. It's also possible to ride on the moving vehicles. The European version of Ape Escape has unique anti-piracy measures that prevent pirated copies from moving past the main menu. Unfortunately, this means that European gamers are unable to play the PlayStation 1 disc on a PlayStation 3, as the software emulation sets off the anti-piracy checks. A wide range of references to pop culture and other video games can be found among the Ape Escape series. In the North American version of the first Ape Escape, the level Dark Ruins contains 4 monkeys with peculiar names: Stan, Kyle, Kenny, and Crapman, a reference to the 4 main characters from South Park. 2 different enemies from Ape Escape 2 were taken straight from the Japanese exclusive PlayStation 2 game Space Fisherman. One of the morph power-ups in Ape Escape 3 references another TV show. The Cyber Ace morph is based on Japanese Super Sentai heroes, otherwise known in North America as Power Rangers. In the European translation of Ape Escape 3, the morph is called Gotchaman, a reference to the Sentai anime Kagaku Ninja Tai Gotchaman. In Ape Escape 3, a minigame can be unlocked that references Metal Gear Solid called Metal Gear Solid, a portmanteau of metal and saru, the Japanese word for monkey, and a reference to Ape Escape's Japanese title, Saru Get You. The minigame features a Peepo monkey based on Snake that uses a banana gun. The monkey's mission is to rescue Snake, who is found at the end being tortured by a Peepo monkey. Metal Gear Solid 3 returned the reference with a minigame called Snake vs. Monkey. The game features Snake on a mission to rescue the same monkeys from Ape Escape. In the communication with the Colonel, Snake states,
"If you want your monkeys, you better ask Kakeru or Hikaru."
Kakeru and Hikaru, of course, are references to the Japanese names for Spike from Ape Escape and Jimmy from Ape Escape 2. The Colonel also reveals that the professor from Ape Escape worked with Otakon on his inventions. Snake must then go through several stages capturing Peepo monkeys, and he even has a victory dance at the end of a round. Other video games have references to Ape Escape as well. The disc-swapping game Monster Rancher 4 contains several versions of the Peepo monkeys from Ape Escape. These monsters are obtained by inserting copies of Ape Escape during Monster Rancher gameplay. The PlayStation exclusive Hot Shots Golf 4 contains a few unlockable PlayStation characters, one of which is a Peepo monkey, who can be used as a caddy in the Japanese and European versions of the game. Ratchet & Clank Up Your Arsenal also contains a reference to Ape Escape. In the Japanese version of the game, entering a secret code unlocks a Peepo monkey costume for Ratchet. Several PlayStation games have also released DLC referencing Ape Escape. Little Big Planet 1, 2, and Karting features a monkey DLC costume for Sackboy. The survival game Tokyo Jungle also has DLC of a Peak Point helmet for the chimpanzees in the game. Over the years, the Ape Escape series has been adapted into 3 different animated series and 13 games including spin-offs. Of these games, only 7 saw a North American release, and 8 were released in the PAL regions. In 2006, fan communities reacted to an ad placed in Famitsu magazine, looking to hire a team for the new Ape Escape game. The ad indicated that the game was the 4th entry in the main series of games. Nothing was heard of the project after, but several spin-off games came along following the ad. Sony potentially teased a 4th game 10 years later in 2016, but no official announcement was made. At the beginning of the year, the PlayStation's official Japanese Twitter account posted an image of a Peepo monkey and stated, "2016, Year of the Monkey. Today, Sony Computer Entertainment will begin working. #monkey, #Year of the Monkey." Unfortunately, no Ape Escape games were actually released in 2016.
Did you know? There was potentially going to be a third Prince of Persia game directed by the series creator, Jordan Mechner. The ending of Prince of Persia 2, The Shadow and the Flame, hints at a new villain who watched the prince's progress through a crystal ball. However, after the development of Mechner's next game, The Last Express, Prince of Persia publisher Broderbund was acquired by The Learning Company. A new sequel began development, but with Mechner taking a less involved role as a consultant to the infamously and critically panned Prince of Persia 3D, and the new villain hinted at during the cliffhanger of Shadow and the Flame was never referenced again. The original Prince of Persia released in 1989 on the Apple II and wowed players with its smooth rotoscoped animation. This was achieved by Mechner filming his brother doing acrobatic maneuvers outdoors in white clothing. He would then use the footage as a reference to create the game's various jumping, running, and fighting animations. Mechner also used some of his favorite movies as a visual reference, such as 1938's The Adventures of Robin Hood. Despite the game being a tremendous amount of work for a one-man team, Mechner wanted the original package to be more ambitious and laments cutting out a full level editor. In an interview with Retro Gamer, Mechner said, "Part of my original plan for Prince of Persia was to include the level editor on the disc, so players could create their own Prince of Persia levels, as Broderbund had done with Lode Runner just a few years earlier. I spent months creating a fully featured, user-friendly level editor, but in the end, the only person who got to enjoy using it was me." While the sprite design of the prince purposely kept his appearance simple, the various home ports of the original Prince of Persia changed his look significantly. This was because the ports were made by different developers from different cultures, several of which were Japanese teams. Most notably, the PC Engine port added a turban and a more Aladdin-like vest to his design, a choice that Mechner liked, as the design was adopted for Prince of Persia 2. The other Japanese-developed ports of Prince of Persia achieved a plethora of additional content, gameplay tweaks, and some questionable creative decisions. While the Sega Genesis port is mostly a faithful adaptation, the Super Nintendo version contained several more levels, an increased time limit, and completely redrawn graphics and cutscenes. One of Prince of Persia's more unusual ports is the Sega CD version, which included animated cutscenes and even voice acting. Ubisoft would ultimately acquire the rights to Prince of Persia and reboot the franchise with the critically acclaimed Sands of Time. Although Sands of Time is very robust, many of its ideas were left on the cutting room floor. The game has a level revolving around a private zoo crawling with sand creatures, but oddly, the only animals that appear are vultures and beetles. According to producer Yanis Mallet in a Gamma Sutra post-mortem article, this section of the game was planned to have enemies such as sand tigers and other mythical creatures. However, these more complicated beast-like enemies would have been too cost-inefficient to implement and had to be cut before release. Much of the core team that worked on Sands of Time had extensive backgrounds working on titles for a younger audience, and according to director Patrice Desilets, this inspired one of the game's most famous mechanics. While working on Donald Duck Goin' Quackers, Patrice proposed that instead of having to replay an entire level once the player dies, they should be able to rewind time and resume the game just before death. This idea was dismissed at the time, but once Patrice was promoted to a director, this was one of the early gameplay hooks for Prince of Persia that evolved into the central mechanic of Sands of Time and has become synonymous with the franchise ever since. While the third game in Ubisoft's trilogy would be released in 2005 as Prince of Persia: The Two Thrones, there was actually an early prototype shown at E3 of the same year known as Kindred Blades, or simply Prince of Persia 3. While it shared some elements with Thrones, it had a variety of differences, including a less linear city to explore, more blood and gore, and various other changes. Most notably, both the prince and his evil doppelganger had different designs than what would appear in the final game, with the Dark Prince featuring striking white hair. The transformation process between the two forms was different as well, with the prince having to burn himself with fire, with the pain acting as a trigger into his more powerful alter ego. After finishing the Sands of Time, Patrice Desilets wanted to take the franchise in a different direction. He then instead pitched a concept called Prince of Persia Assassins. This game would have seen the player assume the role of a member of the prince's entourage instead of the prince himself, with a backstory rooted in a real-world group called the Hashashins. Ubisoft rejected this idea because it was a little too different from the Prince of Persia formula, but they did see potential in the pitch, however, and moved Patrice to his own team. This idea spun off into its own IP for next-generation hardware called Assassin's Creed. The Prince of Persia franchise has fallen victim to various information and media leaks over the years. One notable instance was Prince of Persia 0 having a multitude of character art leaked at the start of 2008, which lessened the impact of its reveal 4 months later. Then in 2012, a screenshot appeared on Ubisoft's forums labeled Pop 02, which appeared to hint at a new unannounced sequel taking place in ancient Egypt. This was later discovered to be another project altogether called Osiris, which never had an official announcement before it was quietly cancelled. Although that project was put aside, Ubisoft did return to an ancient Egyptian setting with Assassin's Creed Origins 5 years later. Then in 2013, screenshots for another project labeled Character Action Platformer 2013 appeared on the website for developer Climax Studios. Due to the aesthetic of the title, many speculated that the game was a new installment in the Prince of Persia franchise. Climax Studio CEO Simon Gardner quickly responded to the speculation, explaining that the screenshots were indeed from a prototype they made for Ubisoft, but this never really went any further. Gardner never mentioned Prince of Persia by name. Interestingly, Climax released the first in the Assassin's Creed Chronicles series in 2015, which happened to have very similar graphics and gameplay to those leaked screenshots. In 2004, Pirates of the Caribbean producer Jerry Bruckheimer acquired the film rights to the Prince of Persia franchise for Disney. Mechner had previously considered making an animated adaptation of the series, but couldn't refuse Bruckheimer and Disney's offer. Mechner was also hired to write the story for the film, which was then adapted into a screenplay by other writers. Though the prince was unnamed in all of the games, Mechner gave him the name Dastan for the film. He came across the name in a passage in Ferdowsi's Shahnameh while researching for the script. The passage read, "I have named you Dastan, the trickster, and from now on you will be known by this name." Mechner liked this name so much that he decided to give the prince a name for the first time in 20 years. On the first day that Jordan Mechner met with Jake Gyllenhaal, the lead actor for the film adaptation, Gyllenhaal informed Mechner of another meaning of the name. In Persian, Dastan can also mean story, which Mechner felt was even more appropriate for the character and the narrative. Mechner was given an executive producer credit and got to fulfill his dream of working on a major motion picture. And while it received mixed reviews for a number of years, it was the most successful video game movie of all time, bringing in an estimated $335 million until it was dethroned by the Angry Birds and Warcraft movies.
Gamers have a bottomless appetite for news from Japan. They want to find out what the next big games are going to look like, hear some behind-the-scenes stories about their old favorites, and maybe even get a glimpse of their favorite developers' personal lives. There's just one little hang-up. Most of them can't speak a word of Japanese. Google Translate and other computer programs are notoriously horrendous when it comes to translating Japanese. And even if they weren't horrendous, most fans wouldn't even know where to look for the information they want to read about. Japanese magazines, books, websites, newspapers, it's simply not practical. So fans are left with no choice but to put their trust in games journalists, Reddit users, and various other internet strangers to find and translate all the Japanese gaming news that's fit to print. But sometimes these translations are actually mistranslations that spread misinformation and create controversy. So, in today's video, we're going to look at 4 mistranslation controversies heard around the world and find out what the developers actually said. First on our list is Junichi Masuda, the Pokemon series director who's ruffled quite a few feathers throughout his career. From the Azure Flute controversy to the egg-hatching debacle and the Bayleaf backlash, the man's received his fair share of criticism over the years. In fact, we could probably fill an entire video with nothing but Masuda controversies, but we'll save that for another day. In the quote we're highlighting in this video, he didn't actually say what news sites reported. In July 2018, Masuda sat down for an interview with Japanese magazine Famitsu to discuss a wide range of topics about the upcoming release of Let's Go Pikachu and Eevee. Soon after, a popular fan site called Centro Pokemon published an article translating parts of the interview into Spanish, which said Masuda was removing wild battles from the game because, quote, some players find it difficult to catch Pokemon with the traditional mechanics of the main series, so he switched to the Pokemon Go style to make catching more accessible. A few hours later, a fan translated and summarized the Spanish article into English and posted it on the Resetera forums, where fans were horrified that Masuda had such a low estimation of his own fans' intelligence. Word quickly spread to Twitter, and that's when people really started to get upset. Outlets like My Nintendo News immediately picked up on the story, and before the day was over, an angry mob of Pokemon fans were outraged that Masuda was cutting wild battles in order to appease small children who were incapable of grasping the series' most basic mechanics. However, that's not what Masuda actually said in the interview. The next day, Nintendo Everything posted an accurate translation of the quote. Masuda says he thought of the previous system as similar to fishing, while the new system was more like catching bugs with a net. Wild battles were getting cut, but it wasn't because he thought his fans were idiots. It was really more about trying something new and trying to build a bridge between longtime fans and all the new fans drawn in by Pokemon Go. Some people still didn't like his decision, but at least they didn't feel insulted about why the decision was made in the first place. A few websites that amplified the mistranslation later updated their articles with the corrected language, but a lot of fans never heard about those updates. As the old saying goes, a lie can travel halfway around the world while the truth is putting on its shoes. In this case, no one lied intentionally. It was really just a case of poor fact-checking, but regardless, much of the damage was already done. Next on our list is a misquote of Final Fantasy VII's director Tetsuya Nomura. About a year before Final Fantasy VII Remake was finished, Nomura sat down for an interview with Japanese magazine Weekly Famitsu. Soon afterwards, Eurogamer published a summary translation that read in part, "It was necessary to restrict her chest," Nomura says in the interview. But as the ethics department pointed out, Tifa shouldn't look, quote, unnatural during action scenes, so her chest was, quote, restricted. Eurogamer's article got a lot of attention on social media, so Polygon wrote an article of their own that assured its readers, "I'm not here to tell you that worries over Tifa's breast size are a sound discussion, because they aren't. If the Mortal Kombat 11 debacle surrounding breasts taught us anything, it's that people are really attached to big boobs no matter what the context." Similar articles made their way onto news sites like GameRant, Metro UK, and The Gamer, with each version of the story getting clickbaitier and clickbaitier as time went on, eventually to the point where they were claiming that Square Enix ethics department had forced Tifa's designer to shrink her boobs. A trail of YouTube reaction videos followed in their wake, and of course folks on Twitter had opinions they wanted to share as well. The whole debacle played out exactly as you'd expect, with some fans saying it's inappropriate for an ethics department to impose their own will on character artists, while other fans called those fans a bunch of basement-dwelling neckbeards. And naturally, some people just wanted to see big boobs. A couple days later, a Japan-based YouTuber named Gaijin Hunter went on Twitter to try and calm things down. He retranslated the part of the interview that set the internet on fire, with the important part being that when asked about Tifa's large bust, Nomura said the ethics department requested they make sure her top wasn't loose. What really been said in Japanese wasn't about restricting her chest or shrinking her boobs, it was actually about making her clothing secure. What's more, Nomura clearly stated that Tifa's silhouette was exactly the same between her original design and her final design. No shrinkage had actually taken place. To be fair to Eurogamer, the original translation about restricting Tifa's chest wasn't horrendously wrong. It was just unclear and easily misunderstood. It was all the other news sites whose trains went completely off the tracks. In the end, Tifa's chest size wasn't much different in the remake, with the exception of a few PS1 cutscenes where they were larger than her in-game model and artwork. Next up, we've got Masahiro Sakurai, the esteemed creator of the Super Smash Bros. Franchise. For context, it's also important to note that Sakurai also created the Kirby series in his late teenage years. In November 2018, more than 14 million fans tuned in to watch the trailer for Smash Ultimate's New World of Light campaign. They watched on as Gallium vaporized fan favorites like Samus, Link, Bowser, not even Pikachu was spared. At the end of the trailer, only one character managed to survive, and of course, it was Kirby. Out of all 74 characters, it just so happened to be a tiny pink puffball who was going to turn the tides and save the world from Gallium's wrath. Fans accused Sakurai of being biased in favor of his own creation, and those accusations came to a crescendo a few weeks later when Sakurai addressed the situation in his bi-weekly Famitsu column. Just a few months earlier, Nintendo Everything rode in to save the day on that Masuda quote, but the situation played out a little differently this time. They published a summarized translation of Sakurai's column that read in part, quote, "Regarding Kirby, Sakurai admitted that he's a bit biased as he created the IP, and fans suspicious on that front are correct." The story was essentially copy-pasted by Newsweek later that day, and the quote seeped into YouTube videos, Reddit posts, and Twitter threads all across the internet, with some fans expressing annoyance and in some cases outrage over Sakurai's blatant bias. But that's actually the opposite of what Sakurai said. The next day, Smash Bros. Fan site Source Gaming published a full word-for-word translation that showed Sakurai wasn't admitting bias. He was predicting that's what some fans were going to assume, while also denying bias was the reason Kirby survived the massacre. Here's the full text with the keywords being, "So why did I choose Kirby? It must be because you created the Kirby series. I thought you might say that. But from a game design perspective and based on process of elimination, Kirby was the obvious choice. Only a vehicle that could defy the laws of physics would actually work." He goes on to later explain that Bayonetta or Palutena could have also conceivably escaped, but World of Light only needs to start with one character. Kirby has a simpler moveset that's easier for beginners, so for the sake of game design, Kirby as the sole survivor objectively made the most sense. Now, while some outlets eventually covered the full translation, a lot of the earlier articles based on the mistranslation were never corrected. Kirby undoubtedly has a special place in Sakurai's heart, but he made a pretty good case for his starring role in the World of Light. So it's probably not entirely fair to say his decision was motivated by personal bias. You guys remember that time Sega said Nintendo's just for little kids? In our final story, we're going to talk about Toshihiro Nagoshi, the chief creative officer of Sega as well as the producer of the Yakuza series. To celebrate the company's 60th anniversary in 2020, Sega Europe conducted an interview with Nagoshi and posted it on their YouTube channel with English subtitles. About 12 minutes into the half-hour video, Nagoshi appears to throw some shade at Sega's old rival Nintendo, saying, quote, "I think even now the Nintendo platform is still a game console that is played by a wide range of age groups. But basically, I think it's hardware for kids and teens." Now, only a few thousand people watched the video, but the quote went viral after a Yakuza fan site called Tojo Dojo went on Twitter and shortened the quote to, "Nintendo hardware is for kids and teens." Sega fans and Nintendo haters memed on it pretty hard, and more than a few Nintendo fans got salty and returned fire with some shade of their own. Nintendo news sites called wind of the drama and ran the shortened quote as headlines, plugging their articles back onto Twitter and adding more fuel to the flames. And yeah, by now you probably already know what happened next. YouTubers reacted, Redditors talked trash, and survivors of the great Sega vs. Nintendo console war picked up their rusty old weapons and jumped back into battle. This time it wasn't a fan-run news site, it was Sega themselves guilty of poor translation. The next day, Gaijin Hunter had to go on Twitter and try to cool things down again, pointing out that the full quote wasn't as hostile as the shortened version, and that a more accurate translation should have read, "Nintendo's platform has and continues to be played by a wide range of age groups, but I think in general their hardware is strong when it comes to kids and teens." So yeah, some folks on Twitter still considered it an insult, but Gaijin assured them there was nothing in the original Japanese that suggested Nagoshi was being hostile or condescending whatsoever. And besides, the full clip shows that Nagoshi was actually talking about Super Monkey Ball, the first Sega game ever released on Nintendo console, which Nagoshi himself created 2 decades earlier. The fact that he's a Yakuza guy and those games weren't ported to the Switch had absolutely nothing to do with it. So yeah, Sega's non-ideal translation and the way it was taken out of context for clickbait made it sound like he was dismissing Nintendo consoles as just for kids, when all he really said was people of all ages love Nintendo and they've been especially successful with the younger generation. A few news sites reported the correct translation, but a lot of console war combatants never heard the real story. And rumor has it that some of them are still out there fighting even to this day. Now, before we wrap things up, we just want to say that most of the news sites we talked about in this video act in good faith and report the news responsibly every single day. Nobody's perfect. We've made mistakes. Mainstream news makes mistakes. Everyone makes mistakes. But you know how it goes. Sometimes mistakes slip through the cracks and take on a life of their own. At the risk of sounding presumptuous, here's some advice for journalists and viewers alike. Next time you see the internet catch fire over an interview translation, take a moment to consider the source before deciding whether to join in or not. Who knows, maybe you'll still want to, or maybe not. We're not your dads, do whatever you want. At the end of the day, we don't really care, honestly.
The year is 2013. It's the year of The Last of Us. Grand Theft Auto 5 has just been released for the first time of many, and a new generation of home consoles is beckoning. Retailers are optimistic about the new systems in spite of recent hardships, as players increasingly switch to buying online. For Game, the UK's leading video game retail chain, the past 2 years have been particularly difficult. 2012 saw them entering administration and closing an enormous 277 stores nationwide, leaving over 2,100 people out of work. The upcoming consoles are expected to provide a much needed revenue boost, but the company is looking for all the help it can get to stand out from their competitors. As the crucial holiday season approaches, they need something big and bold. Enter a marketing campaign designed to turn heads and send stomachs churning in equal measure. Launched originally in December 2013, the Christmas Tinner was a spoof food product from Game. The premise was that this was Christmas dinner in a can for gamers, 9 layers of festive goodness squashed into a single tin. Can't spare even 10 minutes of gaming time to eat a Christmas meal for your family, you socially inept wretch? Well, Game has just the thing for you. It's got egg and bacon, mince pies, turkey and potatoes, gravy, bread sauce, cranberry sauce, broccoli with stuffing, roast carrots and parsnips, and then rounding out the luncheon with Christmas pudding at the bottom. After being unleashed upon the world in time for the holidays, the Christmas Tinner became a phenomenon of sorts, quickly spreading beyond the niche confines of the games media. It was talked about on the radio, featured in newspapers, on daytime TV. It was even mentioned on Saturday Night Live in the US. Despite all of this attention, however, there was one big question that hung in the air, and it's one there is still disagreement about online to this day. Was Christmas Tinner even real to begin with? Some say it was just a marketing stunt, others claim to have genuinely owned one. The further I looked into this, the more I saw how little consensus there was in the matter, and what revealed itself to me was a mystery with as many layers as the product in question. Before we get to the investigation, first here's some Christmas Tinner history. The product first made its debut on December 5th, 2013 for £1.99. It was a fairly modest launch, a few press emails were sent out, and slowly gaming news sites began to pick it up. Included were images of the festive delicacy and some shots of models tucking into it while playing games. The UK tabloid press, eager to never miss an opportunity to disparage video games and those who play them, quickly latched onto the story and dutifully spread the word. It went global, and the Christmas Tinner became known the world over. Game.co.uk was hammered with requests as shoppers searched for the elusive vessels of Yuletide sludge, but the site was not forthcoming. They remained out of stock indefinitely. Did Game severely underestimate the demand? Or was it never available to begin with? Well, that depends who you ask, because there are a number of people online who have claimed to have gotten their hands on it all those years ago. The most prominent of these by far is a YouTuber named Stevie Jacko, who in 2013 posted a video of himself opening one of them and bravely ingesting the contents, without even heating it up either. What's more is, he actually liked it.
For the first layer, that is... I would not moan at that. I wouldn't complain at that at all.
But how did Stevie come to be one of the only people on the internet to experience the Christmas Tinner? I asked him, and his explanation was as follows. My friend works for Game, but he can't get hold of any more cans, which I can't understand. They seem to make a few, then decide not to make any. All a bit weird, as I think it would have took off. For what it's worth, there is some circumstantial evidence to support Stevie's story. In December 2013, Glenn Tickle, an inquisitive writer for the Mary Sue, spoke to him about it. At the time, he claimed to have bought it from a game branch in Basingstoke in the south of England. Now, not only is Game Basingstoke real, part of the original press release noted that they were given some cans in a trial run. The store used to have a Twitter account which did claim to have gotten a small shipment of them that quickly sold out. Just a day after it launched, they said, "We are currently out of Christmas Tinner. Sorry peeps." Commenters expressed their disappointment. I was just on my way to pick up a tin as well. To continue with our history lesson though, the holiday season of 2013 came and went, but the legend of Christmas Tinner lived on. Every year as we approached the festive season, memes about it would start doing the rounds on social media, and Stevie's video would experience an influx of views. For half a decade, come Christmas time, people check Game's site, hoping in vain to procure a can for themselves. It never happens, but a whole 6 years later, Tinner is finally put back on the menu. December 2019 sees the product being unexpectedly revived with a new twist, alongside the original version of vegan and vegetarian options. The relaunch receives, at least in games media circles, a little more pushback this time around. There are suggestions that the revival reeks of desperation, a gambit by a flagging business to claw back some slither of relevance. Here's what VG247 said at the time. Since its 2019, game's new business plan is social media shares and internet outrage via the medium of food in a tin can. The Christmas tinner is aimed at the lazy gamer, which seems a bit daft since a lazy gamer could probably order quite a nice meal from a local takeaway with a few clicks. Still no reason to actually visit game then. Ultimately though, it mattered not, because for a second time around, the Christmas tinner went viral in no time. The newspapers ran with it again, it was mentioned on daytime chat shows, even Stephen Colbert talked about it.
Roast carrots and parsnips and Christmas pudding. And if you eat your way all the way to the bottom, there's a special prize, confronting what you've become.
Given the size at which this ballooned to, you might expect that there were at least some examples of the public trying the product this time around. Not so. Once again, none of them seemed to be found in the wild. No YouTube taste tests or solid evidence they were a real product you could actually buy. On top of that, the Christmas tinner product page on Game's website perpetually listed the item as out of stock. It was then that I decided to reach out to people I knew who had interacted with the tinner phenomenon in some fashion, and one of the first people I spoke to was Dave Aubrey, a game journalist from the UK. Dave was writing about games when the Christmas tinner relaunched in 2019, and at the time, he tweeted that he had reached out to Game in an attempt to obtain a tin for a piece he was writing. He had intended to try it out and report on his findings in a courageous and important act of journalism. I followed up with him to talk turkey. Quote, "Ooh, now this is a throwback. I remember this, but I never actually managed to get one. I believe Game PR at the time had a few they were giving out, but I'm not sure it was ultimately anything more than a PR stunt." An interesting summation, with sentiments echoed by the next person I spoke to. Ryan Brown is a games industry veteran who worked at Game in the mid-2010s. While his time there didn't coincide with either launch, I still valued his input. He was fairly adamant that the tinner was nothing more than a festive facade. My understanding was it wasn't real, just a marketing gimmick that worked so well they recycled the exact same marketing campaign for several years. They probably made a few for marketing purposes, but certainly 100% wasn't an actual proper thing, just a marketing bit. It's at this point in the video that I imagine a lot of people watching will be thinking the same thing as I did. Christmas tinner is obviously not real. This was a stunt to lure in customers to a struggling business. But before we reach any conclusions, I want to first emphasize how widespread the idea was that this thing was absolutely legit. It is not an exaggeration to say that the overwhelming majority of comments on posts about the tinner were written in the earnest belief that it was real. In the replies to Game on Twitter, on YouTube videos about it, on articles, they're all dominated by people who at some point had sincerely bought into it and in many cases wanted to experience it for themselves. I even found a video from the PR firm Game hired in 2013, and the comments are almost entirely comprised of angry customers seething about not being able to get their hands on it. It's a reflection, I think, of how universally the Christmas tinner was taken at face value by the wider media. In almost all of the coverage, from TV to newspaper articles, you will struggle to find even the faintest whiff of skepticism. Everyone wanted to believe that this story was real, and it's not hard to see why. Setting aside for a moment the simple comic value of this whole thing, from a media standpoint, here was a prepackaged story with all the trimmings. It didn't require paying anyone to follow up or research anything. It may well have basically been an advertisement, but that is the transaction a lot of outlets are willing to make for a quick and easy story like this, which is likely to perform well. You don't need to know anything about video games or even like them to form an opinion on it. It's an immediately accessible piece of content that anyone can grasp and have a reaction to. It is perfectly crafted bait for social media and low-hanging fruit for TV pundits to mock. No wonder it took off in the way that it did. For the sake of fairness, it's also worth noting that Game was not a stranger to unusual marketing gimmicks. In 2002, they held a competition in NGC magazine that challenged people to go out in public and take a picture of the most ugly person they could find. This really happened. Quote, "What we want you to do this month is get yourself out and about and hunt down the weirdest/ugliest looking person you can find. You heard, they might have an extraordinary mullet, they might have a massive nose, they might be so ugly that they live in a cave. Whatever it is, we want to see them, and we need cold, hard, photographic evidence. The weirdest/ugliest of the lot gets free GameCube games for a year. Well, the sender of the photo does, not the weird/ugly looking person." The early 2000s was a very different time. Anyway, it's time to explore the true origins of Christmas Tinner and finally get some answers. I tracked down the man behind Christmas Tinner himself, who gave me the scoop, although thankfully not of the product itself. It's August 2013. Chris Godfrey is a student attending Kingston University in England, where he's studying graphic design. It's there, during work on his dissertation, that Chris creates his original cursed concoction. He calls it the All-in-One. It was a 12-course meal of varied cuisines and flavours reduced to mush and packed tightly into a single tin. Included was a cheese course, ravioli, French onion soup, ribeye steak, and pie with ice cream. But a commercial product this was not, it was actually more of an art piece. Chris made the All-in-One as a satirical commentary on consumerism and the UK government's policies of austerity which were barreling down on working people. The designer was interviewed by Kingston University for an article, and from there word spread of his invention. Design websites began covering it, it was featured on the TV show Gadget Man with Richard Ayoade, and it wasn't long until it caught the eye of a marketing creative named Mark Perkins. Mark served as a creative director at a PR firm named MHP Communications. It was in 2013 that the company was hired by Game to create a campaign which would bring attention to their brand in anticipation of a busy holiday season, as both the Xbox One and PS4 hit store shelves. Lending inspiration from Chris Godfrey's creation, Mark proposed a new spin on it: Christmas dinner in a can for bone-idle gamers who can't be bothered to pull themselves away from their new games to eat. The project was enthusiastically given the green light, and Mark went to Godfrey directly to help him realise it. During my research for this video, I found various theories as to what degree the substance seen in the photos was real, with a few skeptics suggesting it was a CGI render. In actuality, it was entirely real, as Mark explained to me. Chris Godfrey made 4 batches of the food product for a day of photography. He was up all night doing it, extremely time consuming, and the layers were held together by gelatin, which gave it that smooth, glossy look. Because it was gelatin, it would collapse after a while at room temperature. That's right, the OG Christmas Tinner was made by hand by a single man. Several tins of real Christmas Tinner substance did exist. It really did consist of the foods described in the press release. Godfrey made it by blending and boiling the various courses down into a paste before encasing it in gelatin like cat food. But was this Christmas concoction ever truly for sale to the public in any capacity? As for the 2013 edition at least, Mark gave me an emphatic no. It was a skillfully crafted hoax, a publicity stunt turned urban myth. Having said that, there remains one loose end. What about Stevie Jacko's video in which he purports to review the product? Well, shortly after I spoke to Stevie, his story began to fall apart like warm Christmas tinner. What first tipped me off was the can in the video. Not only is the colour slightly different from the packaging in the promo shots, there is a noticeable lack of nutritional information, something the UK government requires to be printed on food products like this. I asked Stevie to clarify which department at Game he obtained it from. He told me that his source had worked in distribution, but was no longer at the company. Quote, "I should not have got hold of a can as my friend took it from one of the offices without asking. A seemingly reasonable explanation on the surface of it, but I had finally caught Stevie in a contradiction because without realizing it, he had changed his story. Remember, when he spoke to the Mary Sue in 2013, he had told them that he had purchased his tin from a shop in Basingstoke. Eventually, when I got in touch with Mark Perkins, he was able to put the matter to rest for good. As for the tins with the branding and design, we made maybe a dozen to capture a point of sale shot in a dummy game store at head office. Anyone who got hold of one would be sorely disappointed if they expected a multi-layered Christmas dinner within. We bought a load of tins of beans, removed the wrapping, and put our Christmas tinner design over the can. Anyone claiming to have got hold of a tin of Christmas tinner is on a flight of fancy. What I will say though is that I don't think Stevie had any ill intent behind his deception. It was a prank, a good one, that has fooled thousands upon thousands of people over the best part of a decade. Clearly, making a Christmas tinner that convincing must have taken some effort, and it paid off. The actual 2013 Christmas tinner cans were disposed of in the aftermath of the campaign, according to Mark. Well, save for a couple. He revealed to me that he had rescued one of the only surviving tins as a memento, which now has pride of place in his study. As for Chris Godfrey, by the way, he went on to create this. Yes, really. The architect of the Christmas tinner is the same person behind the world record egg, the most liked Instagram photo of all time. So there you have it, that is the truth behind the original Christmas tinner. It was a real substance, but not a real product. This was a festive ruse that succeeded in what it set out to do, fool the public into visiting games' site and stores. MHP claims that sales almost doubled over the previous year in December 2013 when the tinner launched. It was a similar situation for the 2019 version. A small handful were made for marketing purposes, but once again it was never for sale, contrary to popular belief. The marketing firm in charge of that year's efforts was Rise at 7, and it was made primarily to get people browsing Game's website. People searching for Christmas tinner on Google would find Game's site prominently displayed in the results, click through, and find a product page with it out of stock. However, the description was designed to subtly direct visitors towards a product they could buy. The Christmas tinner is back, a 3-course meal in a tin for those hardcore gamers that don't want to leave their gaming chair on Christmas Day. That's right, it was all an elaborate ploy to sell gaming chairs, and by all accounts it worked. Rise at 7 claims it increased Game's brand awareness and traffic by a notable margin. In the years since it was first revealed, the tinner continued to be talked about, Game didn't stop referencing it, and many people have even attempted to make their own. Real or not, its legacy is undeniable. I had just one question left. Has anyone ever actually eaten an official Christmas tinner? In the case of the 2013 one, Mark Perkins shared that only one person braved it in the end, a social media staffer at MHP named Greg Power, who doubled as one of the models seen in the original promo shots. No footage of the undertaking exists, but Greg is said to have been left feeling queasy by the ordeal. Mark also told me that UK daytime chat show This Morning had reached out to him, offering to have one of their presenters do the honours too. Quote, "The producer called saying Holly wants to try it on air. I would have gone for it, but my boss went nuts in case she got food poisoning and we had to refuse. In hindsight, killing Holly Willoughby with a contaminated tin of Christmas dinner would have been a bad career move." As for the 2019 version, on the other hand, one of Rise at 7's employees named Mark Roffey did in fact finally provide a legitimate taste test video. The verdict?
Taste my feet.
Hello and welcome to Did You Know Gaming Extra. Today we'll be looking at the real-time strategy series Anno. We'll be covering some exclusive behind-the-scenes trivia courtesy of this video's sponsor, Ubisoft. The Anno series has a long history, spanning some 20 years across 6 core titles and several spin-offs. Anno 1800, the latest entry in the series, is on the horizon. So before this game releases, we're taking a look at some interesting trivia from the series. Anno was originally developed by Max Designs and was seen as a competitor to the popular civilization building series The Settlers. Interestingly, Settler's developer, Blue Byte, would go on to develop every mainline Anno title from 2009 onwards, taking the reins of a series that was made to combat their own franchise. This is because Ubisoft not only bought Blue Byte in 2001, but also acquired the Anno license in 2007. Since Blue Byte were already intimately familiar with the genre, Ubisoft tasked them with helping to create the next installment of Anno, which was released in 2009. Ubisoft would then merge related designs into Blue Byte, the two teams who'd worked alongside each other to develop the games under Ubisoft. This put the Settlers development studio completely in charge of working on both Anno and the Settlers series. The first two entries in the Anno series were created prior to related designs' involvement, who seemed to be somewhat superstitious. The team at Related Designs acknowledged that while each of the Anno games is named after the time period it's based on, each of the digits within these dates add up to 9. The team was surprised to find that this wasn't the original intention of the series creators. However, the studio decided to keep the trend going as they believed that it would be a bad omen to change it. Ubisoft sent us to Gamescom to speak with the series creative director, Dirk Riegert, who began working on the series with Anno 1701 as lead game designer. He revealed that at the time he hadn't worked on a game at all before then. I was just arriving in the games world, so I'd never done a game before, and back in those times, it was like, well, have you done this before? No. Do you think you can do it? Sure. Well, great, you got the job. You are the lead designer. To make sure their product was close to the design of the first two entries, Dirk requested all documentation relating to the original games. He waited weeks before realizing that they already had everything after he was given copies of the games and was told to simply play them. The original team was of a relatively small size and made up of only those who could program. Because of this, many of the original game's mechanics were simply programmed, shown to the rest of the team, and committed to the release without any notes or documentation to divulge how they were. To try and make this third entry as close to the original games as possible, the team reverse engineered the initial two titles. Proud of their work, the team had the original developers come in to see how closely they had recreated their code, to which they learnt they'd implemented designs entirely differently. They were told that there was no point in changing it to match the original series, however, as the player would unlikely notice the changes at all. The Anno series is littered with Easter eggs. The credits sequence of Anno 1404 features various characters found within the game, speaking on their experience within the game as though they were performing like actors, making statements like,
"The player clicks, the light goes on, my picture appears, and it's all or nothing."
After the credits end, a video is played from inside the development studio, introducing everybody who'd worked on the game alongside their role. In Anno 2070, the Atlas ship is possibly named in reference to the ancient Greek titan of the same name. The name is fitting as the ship holds aircraft, while the ancient Greek titan was condemned to hold up the sky for eternity. The game contains other references in its achievements. If the player names their city Neo-Tokyo, they will receive the achievement Kaneda! This is in reference to the lead character of the film Akira, as well as the name of the city Akira is based in. Naming the player's submarines Holy Diver will give them the achievement Ride the Tighe, a line from Dio's hit 80s song of the same name. Similarly, naming one of the submarines Yellow will unlock the achievement La 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 la. I can only apologize for that. An onomatopoeic spelling of the chorus of the popular Beatles track Yellow Submarine. By spending 10 minutes with the camera view underwater, the player will unlock the achievement Can Hold His Breath for 10 minutes. This is in reference to Monkey Island, specifically Guybrush Threepwood's ability to hold his breath underwater for 10 minutes. The time period of Anno 1800 was actually discussed during the development of Anno 1404, but the team didn't feel as though they would be able to do the period justice at the time. After 1404, the team took to the future, creating a game in the period of 2070. This lended them the confidence that they would be able to make a game set in the 1800s properly, and thus the latest game was born.
Extra. Today's episode is a spooktacular special. What defines horror? A sense of unease? The abnormal? The downright spooky? Well, games are full of scares, ranging from morbid jokes to unexplained creepy glitches and Easter eggs. Beavis and Butthead in Virtual Stupidity is a point-and-click PC game released in 1995 and ported to the original PlayStation in Japan in 1998. The game centers around Beavis and Butthead attempting to get into Todd's gang by completing various tasks in Highland, Texas. Like most point-and-click games of the time, it isn't possible to die during the game. However, there is one particularly gruesome Easter egg that does allow the player to do so. In the bathroom of the coffee shop found during the Free the Sperm Whales mission, if the player proceeds to click the foot icon on all 3 screws of the broken mirror, then the skull drawn on the side of the stall, a secret cutscene will trigger. Butthead will pull out a weapon, say "F***
you, Beavis,"
and shoot Beavis in the head.
Dumbass.
Another spooky Easter egg comes from the PC game Carmageddon 3 TDR 2000. The game centers around the player racing and smashing other cars up and killing pedestrians. This is much like the film Death Race 2000, to which the original game was meant to be a sequel. In the game, it's possible for the tide to turn on the murderous player. If the player uses the Kangaroo on Command power-up at the north end of the map, they're able to climb a rock wall and find a secret tunnel. When driving down the tunnel, the player will be met with a message stating, "Friggin' Kangaroo on Command, freak." Turning back will show another large message blocking the player, reading, "Now you are stuck, sucker," trapping the player from escaping, forcing them to restart their game. Bethesda are infamous for the numerous glitches in their games, including some pretty weird ones. Possibly one of the creepiest examples of this can be found in the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Throughout the game, there are mannequins that can be used to hang up spare equipment. A number of players have experienced a glitch, which causes these models to adopt the NPC AI. This has led to some spooky moments, such as having the mannequin's gaze follow the player, and sometimes even freely walk around. A Reddit user discovered another pretty shocking Easter egg in the 1999 N64 port of California Speed. When racing on the Mojave Desert track, the player passes by a billboard with a troubling message plastered across it. Sometimes, God takes mummies and puppies away. And sometimes, just sometimes, I do. The texture sparked interest as to how and why this was included in the game, with some theorizing that a disgruntled employee slipped the message into the E-rated game. It wasn't until 18 years after the game's release that the truth behind it was revealed. Randall Rigdon, writing for Pop Optic, reached out to the game's developers for answers. It turns out the billboard was not necessarily intentional, and was a byproduct of the outrageous crunch time on porting the game to the console. Developer Morgan Godat said, "Unfortunately, as we were in a tight situation to even get the most basics of the game stood up on the N64, we didn't have anything handy or relevant to put on the billboards, so I plugged in a placeholder asset billboard texture so fucking stupid there would be no way it could possibly be confused for a real shipping asset. This asset was obviously mistakenly left in due to the time constraints." Strange Easter eggs aren't exclusive to PC and console games. Programs such as Microsoft Excel contained hidden games like a flight simulator and a racing game called Dev Hunter. We're using the word game loosely, as these actually acted more like interactive credits. The first, and perhaps most bizarre, comes in the form of Hall of Tortured Souls, hidden within Microsoft Excel 95. This is accessed by selecting the entire 95th row in a new Excel document, right-clicking, tabbing over to column B, and selecting Help/About, holding down Ctrl, Alt, and Shift while clicking the Tech Support button. Reminiscent of a cross between Doom and the Windows 95 3D screensaver, the player navigates a mysterious and eerie maze and ultimately comes face to face with a room full of developers staring back at them. And now it's time for this episode's random piece of trivia. Today we'll be looking at one of the sequels to the arcade classic Outrun. In Outrun 2006 Coast to Coast, if the player hangs around at the starting line after the race has begun, The flagman will start stretching. After stretching, the flagman will also do a dance. He'll either do a spin on his head or start to do the moonwalk.
Hey everybody, this is Liam here. I hope you're all doing well. It's time for another Elite Beat Agents video. About 2 years ago, I spoke to a developer who worked on the game, Robert Ota Diederich. Robert was a programmer on Elite Beat Agents and went on to the sequel to its Japanese counterpart. Snippets of this chat have been seen in other videos I've done before, such as my documentary for Did You Know Gaming on the history of Elite Beat Agents and the Wendon series, so if you're interested in those games, definitely check that out first. We had a long conversation which unfortunately got cut off about halfway through due to a power cut. However, as a fan of these games, it was still really fun for me to chat to him. A bit of background, it was about 4 AM here, I was trying to be very quiet to respect my neighbours, and I was pretty exhausted, but Robert is such a nice guy and he humoured pretty much every question I threw at him, no matter how dumb it was. So this was a very informal chat, definitely not a professional interview or anything. I asked people on Twitter if they wanted to see some more of it, and so here it is, a developer from Elite Beat Agents answering my dumb fan questions at 4 in the morning. We joined the talk as I've just asked him what is the nature of the energy blast that comes out of the Elite Beat Agents and the people in that game. Not the best question, I guess, but you know, we had been talking for a while, and sometimes, you know, you just ask random things when you have the opportunity. So please enjoy. I swear some of it is interesting.
Yeah, so I think we were talking about the process for how we put it together, or some of the story stuff, I think.
Yes, sure.
We were trying to figure out, like, you know, what is the energy blast that comes out of Elite Beat Agents. But you know, my summation is that it's still Tighe, because we don't have a literal word for it in English. We just kind of like dodged around that.
Yeah.
But it's encouragement. It's spirit. You know, again, because the stories were written first in Japanese and then translated over. You know, they kept a lot of that same style and spirit. Yeah. In case you're wondering, in Japanese, yeah, the text is still too fast for anyone to read. No one reads that fast in Japanese either. They're just like, I can't tell what's going on. I can't read that fast. Like, don't worry, that's the same for everyone.
Yeah, I've always just kind of liked that, because it sort of encourages repeated plays. You know, even in Elite Beat Agents.
That's one way to encourage replay.
Oh, we have a visitor.
We do. Kitty Cat wanted to say hi. Say hi, Misha. Oh, now you're silent. Okay.
Hi, Misha. Speaking of cats, there are a lot of cats in these games, in Wendon and Elite Beat Agents, and I've always been curious about that, because it seems like the same cat recurs throughout all the games, or just about.
Oh, yep, it is. It is pretty much the same cat. There might be some like back of the envelope lore, connect them together. I think at some point, like Umeji-san might have said that, like, the cat that's in the movie, like, it really is supposed to be like that cat, and he might have something like the cat is it was actually the director's cat or something. But I don't know.
Okay, sure.
Yeah. I think there was something in Umeji-san's heart regarding the nature of the cat and everything else.
Right. Okay. Before it got cut off, we were talking about songs that didn't make it in the game, and you mentioned Journey was one that was discussed.
Yeah, that was one. But basically, like, when one of the planners said, like, hey, you know, who'd be a great, who would be great artists to have in this song? I said, like, Journey would be. I think it was specific, like, what should we have for, like, our last song? Like, who'd be good artists for the last one? I'm like, Journey. He's like, Journey. So that's the one that I most distinctly remember.
Yeah, I always thought Jumpin' Jack Flash is a pretty interesting choice, because that's not like a very fast song.
Right.
It was totally reimagined for Elite Beat Agents. Yeah, I always thought that was an inspired choice. I wonder how you guys made that leap in logic to go with that song in particular, and not something like, I don't know, Dragon Force or whatever fast song you could think of.
Well, Dragon Force, they were really big at that point. I don't.
Yeah, I had just a random example.
I know what you mean. Yeah, I'm not sure what the process like that led to that. How exactly that decision stream came about.
In terms of songs that maybe were discussed, one that I had heard a rumor about from a Nintendo source was that a Guns N' Roses song might have been in the talks at some point or another. Do you remember anything about that?
I didn't hear anything about that. It would have been really cool.
Okay, yeah. I think it was, if I remember correctly, the rumor was that Welcome to the Jungle was one that was talked about, maybe, and I have no idea how far along this got.
Right.
But it maybe it got, I don't know, onto a potential list if it reached NOA. You know?
Yeah, I think we had actually a pretty big list that we sent them, because I kind of remember there being a little bit of, a sort of like rending of the cloth, a sort of a little bit of like, oh man, kind of agony over a lot of songs that we weren't able to get.
Okay.
So I kind of vaguely remember that being around there. It's maybe like Yano-san and the producer I was talking about, Haraguchi-san, maybe talking to each other, just be like, oh, we couldn't get that. Like, oh. No, really wanted to have that,
Yeah.
So
we talked about songs that were cut, quote unquote.
right.
Living La Vida Loca, you said, was intended to be match up with one of the scenarios from the first levels in the game. Possibly the movie director guy.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's the movie director one.
Okay. Yeah.
I do remember having like some long markers that would just like da 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 da. You can imagine it's like ba 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 da 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 right there in times with like the da 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 of Living La Vida Loca, and it felt really good.
So that was really built into the game, was it?
I don't know how many sort of quality passes we'd done on it at that time. Like we tended to rework charts a lot.
Okay.
We'd rework charts, rework story art a lot. I remember like for Owen 2, like I remember like seeing some of the art had changed completely from like previous versions. There's a lot of times where we did like retakes and redraw in order to make things just look that much better. Remember like some of the bits with like if you play the game with the cheerleaders in like the one scene where there's like the hot bath, I think that got redrawn several times in general to make it a little bit sexier.
Oh, really?
Somehow we figured out we could get away with it.
That's interesting. I was playing that the other day and I thought, wow, that is particularly risque for a Nintendo game. Because you straight up, I think the girl is topless, and
yes, she's got the nice sexy back thing, everything going on there. Like, I'm amazed what they let us do.
If I remember correctly, you covered the breasts with the gap in the screens.
DS. Yeah.
But yeah, we've talked about songs that were cut, but were there any, say, scenarios, stories that didn't make the cut? Because when I heard that Living La Vida Loca was cut, I always imagined for whatever reason there might have been a separate scenario for it or something like that. Or was it just, you shuffled the songs around?
Occasionally we'd like shuffle the order of songs to kind of, in terms of dramatic tension. Right. At some point, I think I do remember Yano-san like kind of putting out open requests for like more stage ideas. And I think pretty much every stage idea that everyone came up with, he looked at it and said like, yeah, that's not nearly crazy enough.
Yeah.
So I don't know that anything that like the standard staff suggested was quite insane enough for this world.
Yeah.
I do remember there were a couple meetings for a while, and this was I remember this for Owen 2, but I think we had the same thing for EBA, where there'd occasionally be meetings between like Yano-san and there'd be like Umeji-san, who did the storyboards, and I think a couple other writers that we would bring on.
Yeah.
And they would basically have, I think for a while they referred to them as just like the funny meetings, the emoshirosa meetings, or the interesting meetings. Like I think they were basically doing like iteration passes on the story, like how do we make this funnier?
Yeah.
It's like this is all right, but how do we take it to like the push it to that level?
Yeah, well, they are pretty crazy, those stories. Yeah. Is there any other interesting anecdote or trivia that you can share from working on these games, whether it's Owen 2 or EBA? Is anything that comes to mind that you think is interesting? And if you'd like to tell your anecdote about crying at the anthem song, then
Oh, sure. I can tell that again. Where again, this is the working on Elite Beat agents early in my career. It was a really lucky experience, and this was the game that made me cry during development, but in a good way. In the good way, which is basically, every morning, we go into the office and you'd grab the latest data. I'd grab the latest data from source control, grab stuff from the file server, put it all onto the little sort of DS dev kit, and I'd run it to see what we had, what new data we'd actually managed to put together. And I saw, we have this new stage came in, and it was the one with the baseball player, and we have the intro story was put together. And I start, of course, curious. I got to look at it, and I watch the story, and these are all very cliche stories, but that's kind of what you have to love about the game. And it has the washed up baseball player who kind of got into a slump and ended up leaving the game, but he's still he can't quite let go, so he's sweeping the floors at the stadium as a janitor, and then some kid recognizes him. It's like, oh, aren't you Strong Arm Jones, or whatever the name of the character was? He's like, oh wait, aren't you so and so? And you see the baseball player just pull his hat down. It's like, nah, you got the wrong guy, kid. And I was totally unprepared for just having that little emotional kick. It's not something that would normally make you cry, but I was sort of I was unprepared for it, because I was thinking oh, I'm going to get ready to just do some work soon. Let's just see what's in there. And this moment just kind of kicked me. Mm-hmm. And I remember having a little tear, noticing that there's a tear in the corner of my eye, and I wiped it away. I'm like, what am I doing? I'm at work crying. What the heck? Damn game, make me cry. But that sort of experience, if anything, all the game dev that I've done since then, that's one of the things I've tried to figure out how I can have again. I want to have that moment again where I am so into what I'm making that it literally brought tears to my eyes, which is really great. And this was sort of the experience for the whole game, where everyone really, really cared about it. That's why Nintendo of America made shirts for us. There's that one particular NO18. They made these kind of these one-off shirts. Which, as far as I know, only the Innis dev members and certain people at NOA have those particular shirts, which is why I never wear that T-shirt except for super special occasions, because I want it to last forever. Because this game, really, really love it. Yeah. I really love the game. Really loved working on the game. So in Owendon 2 is the first game where I got to work on stuff outside of menus. First project where I got to do a little bit of adding extra features to the in-game, which was really cool. It showed that I managed to not screw things up enough that they put some trust into me to add some features to the really precious part of the game. But the funny thing, when I thought about the features that I added, were basically made for either the most extreme players or the worst players in the game. Because the features that I ended up adding were the bit where if you lose in easy mode, you basically have an extra life, where Domeki Kai, the boss of your Owendon, or the boss of your Owendon, will suddenly show up out of the bottom of the screen and tell you to basically throw in some more ki, and it'll fill up your energy bar so you can so you can continue the stage from where you were. And then the other settings I ended up adding were the bits where you'd make the markers disappear before you're supposed to touch them.
You were the fiend that added that to the game, were you?
Yeah. I think it was probably the producer. It was probably Fuji-san, who was a producer who came to us from Monolith. He was a former Monolith person, so he was actually literally right across. He came from across the street. There were certain restaurants in the neighborhood, because we were in the same neighborhood as Monolith Softs. So there were actually certain restaurants that he didn't like to go to because he'd run into former coworkers. Not that it was a bad relationship. It was just weird. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so he added the extra features at the end that you could sort of unlock to make the game extra hard. So my first contributions to gameplay were at the far extremes of our difficulty curve.
That's so cool.
Yeah, I loved working on that.
Yeah.
I remember some of the pictures for the galleries for the game. We actually had to do a little bit of trickery in order to get all the colors we needed on there.
Okay.
Because the DS is weird, because parts of its architecture were basically they're inherited from the GBA, which inherited its structure from the Super Nintendo. So there is still literally a Mode 7 in there, and some of the API you can look at it and say like, yeah, this is probably the same functions, maybe updated a bit, that were called on the GBA on somewhere else. And there are various limitations for how many colors you can have using what systems. So in order to display some of the pictures in the gallery, we would have bits where most of the picture would be done up in one system, might have been done up in the 3D, using the 3D system, just doing like a flat plane. And then to get a few of the extra colors, we'd managed to sort of extract out some of the colors, and we would lay additional basically sprites as patches, so we could have the extra colors showing up for certain bits. Do you know what happens when you close the DS lid while you're in the training mode for the game, when you're in the tutorial?
No, I don't.
It makes you restart the tutorial. Like if you do that, at least in Oendan, I think we end up doing the same thing, similar things for Elite Beat Agents and Oendan 2. We have your leader. The leader shows up and tells you to restart the tutorial from the beginning.
Why?
In all the other stages of the game, if you close the DS midway and then open it up, it will still play music. Like the music will continue on. Like the game will continue on. It'll come back from suspend, no problem. The tutorial modes, there was actually this MIDI thing they were using for the drum beat, which was different from all the other stages. I think because we needed it to be able to loop endlessly. We weren't just playing one song to the end. It was kind of looping while we're trying to teach you how to do all the basic gameplay stuff. And I think no matter what we did, this was the story I heard, is that no matter what we did, after the suspend, there were cases where that loop would get out of sync. And so that was a problem. Either we didn't have time or it was just kind of too risky to fix. And so we ended up coming up with this other solution, which was basically saying like, okay, well, we'll set it up so if you close the lid and open it up, the leader of your troop will get mad at you. And because of that, he'll make you start the tutorial from the beginning, thus avoiding having stuff get out of sync. But that was only for the tutorial because they had that one special feature on there.
Interesting.
Do you know there is this bug in the game, which happens pretty rarely, but every once in a while, in the world menu of EBA, the top screen will be black and distorted.
I've not come across that myself.
Yeah, it's super rare.
Okay.
But I remember when that one showed up, because it showed up pretty much right before we were kind of doing our final release. We were supposed to do like our final like gold master. And I remember like me and the other programmers really gnashing our teeth trying to figure out what was going on there, because we didn't know what it was. And I think our lead programmer, Okada-san, he did manage to figure it out eventually, but this was maybe weeks later. So we did end up shipping with this bug. We did whatever we could to try to sort of like minimize the chances of it occurring, because we didn't know why it was happening. Okay. But there's a sort of a series of like, if you go back and forward between like the previous menu and the stage menu, there was some condition that you could cause to make the top screen occasionally be distorted when you'd select certain stages.
I think I do remember that actually, like coming across that once. But
yeah,
that's pretty good considering how much I've played it.
Yeah, but that was my thing. We spent we spent a couple days gnashing our teeth over that one. I remember.
Ooh, well, yeah.
We minimized it. It used to happen more. So for Smash Brothers, we had to make we happily made some like relatively high poly versions of Agent J and the lead characters from Oendan.
Yes.
And Oendan 2. And because for use as trophies, but that meant that we had like these high def models for them, and so we used them for testing lots of stuff.
Okay.
So there have been sort of prototypes where for like the test model there'd be like Agent J doing all this cool dancey stuff. I do remember at one point when we were learning how to use Unreal Engine, someone grabbed Agent J and tossed him into Unreal, and I think it was like basically tossed him into a Gears of War map. So there was some point where Agent J is like dancing around, and I saw someone like shooting him with Marcus Phoenix.
Hey, that's me.
Like, he wasn't reacting. He was like leaving bullet holes. It was like he was like an invincible statue.
Sure.
But yay.